He wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to need anyone. And the moment he grabbed her arm at the edge of that open shaft, both of their lives changed in ways neither of them was ready for. Novacor's untouchable CEO, a single father with nothing left to lose. One split second between life and death, and a secret that could destroy everything they were building. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because this one goes all the way. The elevator was a coffin made of steel and glass, and Ethan Walker noticed the problem before the doors even finished opening. He was standing in the lobby of Novacor Industries on a gray Tuesday morning, badge still warm from the lanyard they'd pressed into his hands 40 minutes ago during the world's most efficient HR orientation. His folder of first-day paperwork was tucked under his arm. His tie, the one Mia had insisted on picking out, navy with a tiny repeating diamond pattern, was slightly too tight because she'd tied it herself, and he hadn't had the heart to fix it. He was 32 years old, freshly hired into a temporary operations role he'd been told carried a competitive probationary review at the 90-day mark, and he was already thinking about the grocery list he needed to finish before pickup at 3:15. That was when he heard it. Not a crash, not an alarm, just a sound like something mechanical deciding, very quietly, to give up. A low metallic groan from inside the elevator to his left, followed by a brief, almost polite shudder. And then the doors froze halfway open, stuck at a gap just wide enough to reveal what was happening inside. Vanessa Hale's wheelchair had rolled backward. It wasn't far. Maybe 8 inches, maybe 10. But the elevator car had stopped level with the lobby floor on one side, and on the other, through the maintenance panel that had somehow come unlatched at the rear of the car, there was a freight shaft, open, dark, no safety barrier, the kind of gap that building code violations were made of, the kind that showed up in lawsuits, and right now it was directly behind the rear wheels of the CEO's chair. She hadn't screamed. That was the first thing Ethan registered. Vanessa Hale was gripping both armrests with the controlled stillness of someone who had taught herself years ago not to show fear, not publicly, not ever. And she was watching the lobby with an expression that was working very hard to stay composed while her knuckles went white against the chrome. 2 security guards were already moving toward the elevator. A woman from reception had pressed herself flat against the desk like the additional distance would help. A man in a tailored suit, some kind of VP, Ethan would learn later, had his phone halfway out of his pocket, eyes bouncing between Vanessa and the camera in the corner of the lobby as if calculating optics before deciding on action. Ethan dropped his folder. He didn't think about it. He didn't do the math. He crossed the lobby in maybe 4 strides, jammed his shoulder against the half-open elevator door to stop it from triggering a close cycle, and reached inside with both hands and grabbed the push handles at the back of the chair. The floor of the elevator shifted. Not dramatically, just a slight tilt, a small hydraulic sigh from whatever mechanism had already failed, but it was enough. The chair moved another 3 inches toward the shaft. Ethan felt it through his hands and pulled hard in the opposite direction, planting his left foot against the elevator door frame and his right foot braced on the lobby tile, leaning back with everything he had. The chair rolled forward, clear, past the threshold, onto solid lobby floor. He let go and stepped back, breathing hard, and for a moment the lobby was completely silent, except for the elevator making another low, unhappy sound before the doors finally closed on their own. Ethan straightened his tie. Mia's knot had survived the ordeal, and then he looked up, and Vanessa Hale was looking at him. She was 30 years old, and she ran a company with 4,000 employees and a market cap that financial journalists like to compare to rising stars in the tech sector. And right now she looked like a woman processing something she hadn't planned for. Her expression was difficult to read, not because it was blank, but because there were too many things moving across it at once, and she was visibly deciding which one to let show. She settled on professional. "You're new," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He cleared his throat. "Ethan Walker. Operations." Operations. She repeated the word like she was filing it somewhere. Her eyes dropped briefly to his tie, the navy diamond pattern, and then came back up. "Were you injured?" "No." "Good." She adjusted her grip on the armrests, spine perfectly straight. "The elevator will need to be taken out of service and inspected. Please inform building maintenance on your way to HR." And then she wheeled past him toward the executive corridor, because apparently what had just happened was a maintenance issue and not a near-death experience. And Ethan stood there in the lobby watching her go and thinking, well, that's one way to start a Tuesday. The security guards were staring at him. The VP had put his phone away. The woman from reception was looking at Ethan the way people look at someone who has just done something either very brave or very stupid and isn't sure which category to put it in yet. Ethan picked up his folder, straightened his papers, and went to find building maintenance. He had taken this job because the rent was due, because Mia's school had just sent home a form about an upcoming field trip that cost $45, and because his last position, a solid, stable role with a mid-sized logistics firm, had ended when the company restructured and eliminated his entire department in a single afternoon. 11 people out in one email. He'd been the one who'd spent the following 3 weeks helping his former colleagues update their resumes, because that was who Ethan Walker was, apparently, even when his own situation was dire. His sister-in-law, Carol, had forwarded him the Novacore posting with a message that said only, "This is operations. You're good at operations. Apply." Carol was direct like that. She'd been direct since before her sister Ethan's wife had passed 4 years ago. She'd stayed that way through the funeral, through the brutal months after, through the slow, ugly work of learning how to be a father to a 3-year-old grief-struck child without a partner to carry half the weight. Carol showed up every Thursday for dinner, brought too much food, and never once asked Ethan when he was planning to move on, because she understood, better than most, that moving on wasn't a direction, it was just a story people told so the grief would feel less permanent. He'd applied for the Novacore position on a Sunday night after Mia was asleep, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-finished glass of water and a spreadsheet showing exactly how many weeks he could sustain their current situation before something structural broke. Temporary operations position, competitive salary, 90-day probationary review. He'd thought 90 days. I can do 90 days. He had not anticipated saving the CEO's life on day one. But the orientation debrief was held in a small, glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor, and the HR coordinator, a brisk, careful woman named Priya, who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, made a point of saying twice that Ethan should feel proud of his quick reaction without dwelling on it too long, because the company had an internal process for documenting incidents, and the formal report would be handled through the appropriate channels. "What she means," said the man next to Ethan, leaning over slightly and keeping his voice low, "is that nobody talks about anything that makes Ms. Hale look anything other than completely in control." His name was Dennis. He was a mid-level project coordinator who had been at Novacore for 3 years and had the particular brand of institutional knowledge that only comes from having survived 3 rounds of restructuring and 1 hostile board takeover attempt. He was the kind of person who knew where every fire escape was before the alarm went off. "Is she always like that?" Ethan asked. "Like what?" "Like she'd rather file a maintenance report than say thank you." Dennis thought about this. "She says thank you," he said finally. "She just does it in ways that don't look like gratitude from the outside." He paused. "Or maybe she doesn't. I've been here 3 years and I still can't fully tell." After orientation, Ethan found his temporary workstation, a desk in a shared bay on the 4th floor where the operations team occupied a room that smelled like printer ink and someone's aggressive lunch. His desk had a view of a parking structure. He settled in, opened the operations manual they'd given him, and started reading. At 4:45, Priya appeared at his desk with a reassignment notice. Effective tomorrow, Ethan Walker would be working from a desk outside the executive suite on the 14th floor. Direct operational support to the CEO's office. His access badge had already been updated. Parking validation would also be updated, because the executive floor had a different structure and the sticker color mattered, apparently. "Is this a promotion?" he asked. Priya looked at him with the expression of someone who has learned to keep their interpretation of events private. "It's a reassignment," she said. He thought about asking why. Then he thought about the lobby and the chair and the expression on Vanessa Hale's face when she'd said, "You're new." And he decided that asking why would probably not change the answer, and that he should just go home, make dinner, help Mia finish her science worksheet, and show up to the 14th floor in the morning. Okay, he said. What time do I start? 8 o'clock, Priya said. She's already there by 7:15. The executive floor of Novacor was a different country, where the rest of the building ran on controlled chaos, overlapping voices, ringing phones, the particular background hum of people trying to look busy when someone senior walked past. The 14th floor operated like a climate-controlled library. The carpet was darker. The lighting was warmer. The air felt somehow more deliberate. Ethan's desk was positioned at the end of a short corridor that angled toward the double doors of the CEO's suite. It was a real desk, substantial and polished, with a monitor already booted up and a keyboard still in its packaging. Whoever had occupied this position before him had left no trace. The desk was a blank slate. He was logged in and working through an operations backlog by 8:04 when the double doors opened and Vanessa Hale wheeled out of her office, turned sharply to avoid a floor lamp that stood too close to the corridor path. It had clearly been moved slightly from its original position, Ethan noticed, to give her more room, and stopped when she saw him. She looked at his desk. She looked at him. She looked at his tie, which today was a dark green with a subtle stripe. Because Mia had said, "This one makes you look important, Daddy," and he'd been powerless to choose otherwise. "Walker," she said. "Good morning." She had a tablet in her lap, a coffee balanced in a cup holder attached to the chair's armrest, and a look on her face that suggested she had made decisions she was entirely at peace with and did not require his opinion on. She was wearing a dark blazer tailored over a cream blouse. Her hair was pulled back cleanly. She looked in the way of certain people who have spent years being underestimated, like someone who had decided a long time ago to remove any possible source of doubt from her appearance. "You'll be handling inbound operations requests before they reach my office," she said. "You'll also coordinate between facilities, IT, and vendor contracts. There's a backlog from the past 2 weeks. My last assistant transferred out." A pause. "You'll find the handoff notes incomplete." "Okay." "There's no okay in this office. Either it's a problem that needs to be flagged or it's something you'll handle." Ethan considered this. "Then I'll handle it," he said. She looked at him for a moment, not evaluating exactly, but something adjacent to that. Then she turned and wheeled back toward her suite. "The floor lamp needs to be moved 18 inches to the left," she said, without turning around. "It's been in the wrong position since last Tuesday." He moved it. The next morning it was in the right position when she came through, and she didn't mention it, and Ethan filed that away as the operational equivalent of a passing grade. Holt, the thing about working in close proximity to someone like Vanessa Hale was that you very quickly learned the difference between what she said and what she meant, and that the gap between those two things was not deception, it was armor. She was precise, which he respected. She was impatient with laziness, but not with difficulty, which he figured out in the second week when he hit a genuine wall on a vendor contract discrepancy and told her directly that he needed another day instead of submitting a half-finished resolution. She'd looked at him for a beat and then said, "Fine, but I need the full analysis, not just the conclusion." He gave her both. She read it the same afternoon and sent him a one-line email. "Correct. File with procurement and loop in legal." That was the high praise version. He learned her schedule the way you learn the layout of a house you're new to. Not by memorizing it, but by paying attention. She was in by 7:15 every day. She took lunch at her desk except on Thursdays when she had an off-site physical therapy session that she logged on her calendar as a standing external meeting and that no one on the 14th floor ever commented on, ever. She worked late 3 nights a week, sometimes 4. She did not chat. She did not do the kind of sideways office small talk that most executives use to manage relationships. The how was your weekend, big plans for the holidays routine that was really just proximity maintenance dressed up in casual language. What she did do, Ethan noticed, was watch. She paid attention in a very specific way, the way of someone who had learned that what people said and what they did were 2 different data sets, and that the second one was more reliable. He figured out, around week 3, that she had put him at this desk not despite what had happened in the lobby, but because of it. Not as a reward, as a test. She wanted to see if someone who had done an impulsive, risk-heavy thing on day 1 was actually reliable in the slower, less dramatic work, or whether the elevator moment had been adrenaline and the rest of him was ordinary. He was fine being tested. He had nothing to prove to anyone except Mia, and Mia's metric was whether he came home on time and remembered to put the star sticker on her reading chart. It was a Wednesday afternoon in the fourth week when everything shifted. Ethan had stayed slightly late to finish a facilities report, and he was in the process of shutting down his computer when the elevator opened and Mia came out of it. This was not supposed to happen. Mia was 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and Ethan's stubbornness, and a gap between her two front teeth that she was genuinely proud of, and that made her smile look like something assembled with great enthusiasm and imperfect tools. She was wearing her school backpack, which was shaped like a dinosaur, and she was holding Carol's hand, and she looked around the 14th floor with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere very important. "There you are," she said when she spotted Ethan. Carol, 2 steps behind her, mouthed, "I'm sorry," over the top of Mia's head. She'd had a work emergency, apparently, and the after-school pickup had turned into an unexpected transit situation, and Mia had very firmly informed Carol that she knew where her dad worked, and it was not that far, and they should just go there. "You can't be up here, Bug," Ethan said, crouching to Mia's level. "Why? Are you in trouble?" "No. It's just—" "Is that her wheelchair?" Ethan turned. The double doors to the CEO suite were open. Vanessa had come through and stopped in the corridor, tablet in hand, apparently on her way somewhere, and she had stopped because there was a 7-year-old standing in her corridor looking at her wheelchair the way most people looked at something genuinely interesting, rather than the way people looked at it when they were trying very hard not to look at it. "Yeah," Ethan said carefully. Mia walked toward Vanessa with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to perform hesitation. She stopped a few feet away and studied the wheelchair with focused attention. "Does it have motors?" she asked. Vanessa blinked. "It does not. It's manual. My friend at school has one with motors. She lets me push it sometimes, but she said the motors are better because she doesn't have to wait for people." Mia looked up. "Do you push it yourself or do people push it for you?" "I push it myself," Vanessa said. "That's probably better," Mia said, with great seriousness, "because then you can go wherever you want." There was a pause. Ethan was in the process of formulating an apology that would somehow encompass both the intrusion and his daughter's unfiltered observation style. But before he could get it out, something happened on Vanessa's face that he had not seen there before. It wasn't a full smile. It was closer to the thing that happens just before a smile, when the defenses come down by about 0.5 millimeter and the face does something true. "That's correct," Vanessa said. "That's exactly why." Mia nodded, satisfied. "What's your name?" "Vanessa." "I'm Mia. My dad works here. He said it's an important company." "Did he?" "He also said his boss is really serious." Mia tilted her head. "Are you the serious boss?" Vanessa looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at the ceiling. "I've been told that," Vanessa said. "That's okay," Mia said. "My teacher is serious too, but she's actually nice. You can be both." Carol from behind Ethan's shoulder was making the face of someone watching a car approach a speed bump very fast and deciding whether to warn anyone. Vanessa looked at Mia for a moment longer, then she looked at Ethan. "You should take your daughter home," she said. "The facilities report can be submitted in the morning." "Yes, absolutely. Mia, can I see the rest of the floor?" Mia asked. "No," Ethan said. "It's not very interesting," Vanessa said at the same moment. "But the elevator has a mirror in it, the whole wall." Mia's eyes went wide. "The whole wall?" "The whole wall." Mia looked at Ethan with the expression she used when she wanted him to understand that the universe had just aligned in her favor and she did not intend to waste it. He gathered his bag and his daughter and steered her gently toward the elevator, and as the doors closed, he caught a glimpse of Vanessa Hale, still in the corridor, watching them go, with the expression of someone who has just been surprised by something small and is not entirely sure what to do with it. After that, things were different. Not dramatically. Not in any way that would have been legible to someone watching from outside. But the 14th floor had a different quality to it. Vanessa still worked behind closed doors. She was still precise and demanding and unlikely to tell you that you'd done something well, unless the silence that followed meant exactly that. But she came through the corridor more often on her way somewhere, and occasionally she paused at his desk on her way back and said things like, "The vendor issue with the Reyes contract. Did you see the clause on page 17?" And then actually waited for his answer instead of rolling past before he could give it. She asked him once what Mia was studying in school. "Science," he said. "She's doing a project on weather systems. She seems interested in how things work mechanically." "She is. She took apart a toaster last month." "Did she put it back together?" "Mostly." Vanessa made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same zip code. "My father had a phrase for that. Curiosity is not a malfunction." "He sounds like a good engineer." He was. She was already turning back toward her office when she said it, and the past tense came out quiet and settled, the way things do when the grief has been with you long enough to become just a fact. 5 weeks in, Ethan was cross-referencing the operational cost reports with the quarterly procurement logs, because there was a discrepancy in the international vendor line items that didn't make sense, numbers that were too round, too clean, appearing in accounts that had no corresponding operational output. He'd started looking at it because one of the facilities requests had referenced a contract that didn't appear anywhere in the active vendor database, and he'd pulled the financial thread mostly out of habit. By 8 o'clock on a Thursday evening, he had 4 spreadsheets open and a feeling in his stomach that was slow and cold and specific. He thought about the numbers for a long time. He thought about the name on the contracts, shell companies, all of them, cycling through different jurisdictions, all routed through a single approval chain that converged at one signature. Damian Cross, Chief Financial Officer. Ethan printed nothing. He saved nothing to the company's server. He forwarded nothing to anyone. He closed the spreadsheets, shut down his computer, and sat in the quiet of the 14th floor for several minutes thinking about what he had just found, and what it would mean to have found it, and what the right thing to do was, and how badly things could go if the wrong person found out he'd been looking. Then he picked up his bag, went to the elevator, and pressed the button for the lobby. He needed to pick up Mia tomorrow morning, and he needed to be rested and clear-headed, and the information would still be there in the morning, and he'd figure out the next step then. He was almost right about all of that. What he didn't see, because he was already in the elevator, was the small security camera icon that blinked in the corner of the IT monitoring dashboard, the one that logged which employee accounts had accessed which files in after-hours sessions, and the quiet notification that was already making its way automatically to a secondary inbox. And he didn't see, because he was already in the parking structure, the message that arrived in Damian Cross's personal email 4 minutes later, flagged as high priority, containing a single line. Walker is in the procurement files. Bob. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the 14th floor at 7:58 to find that his desk had been reorganized. This was not unusual. Facilities sometimes did a night cleaning sweep, but the reorganization had the particular quality of someone looking for something rather than straightening up, and the drawer that he kept his legal pad in was not fully closed. He sat down. He opened his computer. He started his day. At 9:15, Vanessa came through the corridor and paused at his desk, which was not the usual rhythm. She had a look on her face that he had begun to learn to read, the compressed quality of someone carrying something they haven't decided to share yet. Walker. Morning. Did you have any issues accessing operational files yesterday evening? He looked at her. No, he said. Why? It flagged an after-hours access pattern on your account. Procurement files, mostly. International vendor contracts. She held his gaze. Anything I should know about? He made the decision in about 3 seconds. Yes, he said, but not here. She looked at him for a long moment. My office, she said. Now. He followed her through the double doors into the office that was larger than it needed to be and sparse in the way of someone who had removed everything unnecessary. And he sat across from her desk in a chair that was positioned lower than hers, which he suspected was deliberate, and he told her what he had found. He told her clearly. He told her without editorializing. He told her the account names, the contract numbers, the pattern in the approval chain. He told her he hadn't forwarded anything or printed anything, and why. And when he was done, he waited. Vanessa was quiet for a long time. Why tell me, she said finally. Because it's the right thing to do. That's not a strategy. No, he said. It's not. She looked at him, and this was different from the other time she'd looked at him. Different from the lobby, different from the corridor. This had a weight to it, like she was measuring something that couldn't be measured from the outside, and she was trying to work out whether the number was what she thought it was. "I'll need to verify everything you've described before any formal action," she said. "Do not access those files again until I tell you to. Do not discuss this with anyone." And Walker, "Yeah, if you're right about what you found," she said, and her voice was level and careful, "there are people in this building who will move to protect themselves. You need to understand that." "I know," he said. She nodded once and turned back to her screen, and the meeting was over. He went back to his desk and spent the rest of the morning finishing the facilities report he'd meant to file the day before. And he thought about Mia's science project, and he thought about the look on Damien Cross's face at the board meeting he'd attended 2 weeks ago. Polished and assured, and the specific kind of smooth that meant someone had worked hard to make sure nothing rough ever showed. And he sat with the slow, cold feeling in his stomach and did not let it become panic, because panic was expensive and he couldn't afford the overhead. The day moved forward the way days do. The building hummed, the phones rang. On the 14th floor, behind the double doors of the executive suite, Vanessa Hale was doing something that looked like regular work and was actually something else entirely. Something urgent and quiet and invisible. And down the hall in his office with the view of the city, Damien Cross was doing something very similar. And in between them, at the desk in the corridor with the tie that was slightly too formal for the position and the drawer that didn't quite close right, Ethan Walker answered emails and flagged a maintenance request and waited. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary afternoon, indifferent and enormous, full of people who did not yet know what was coming. The drawer that didn't close right bothered Ethan for 3 days before he stopped noticing it. That was the thing about working in a state of low-grade alertness. You adjusted. You recalibrated what counted as normal until the thing that had once felt like a warning sign became just part of the landscape, the way a strange sound in an old house eventually becomes background noise instead of something to investigate. He went through that week answering emails, coordinating facilities requests, managing the backlog of vendor communications that had accumulated before his arrival, and he did all of it with the particular focused steadiness of a man who understood that visible anxiety was a liability he couldn't afford. Vanessa said nothing more about the procurement files. She gave no indication, in the corridor or in the brief operational check-ins that had become their morning rhythm, that anything had changed. She was the same, precise, contained, unlikely to waste a word she didn't mean. But Ethan was paying closer attention now, and he noticed that she had started closing her office door during calls that would previously have been conducted with it halfway open. He noticed that she had a brief, quiet exchange with the head of internal security one afternoon that ended with the security director nodding once, tightly, and leaving without the usual small talk. He noticed that a consultant he didn't recognize appeared on the 14th floor for 40 minutes on a Friday afternoon, carrying a laptop and a visitor badge and leaving without stopping at anyone else's desk. He didn't ask. She hadn't told him to stay out of it, but she also hadn't invited him in, and he understood the distinction. He'd handed her the thread. What she did with it was her call. What he focused on instead was the work, the actual operational work, which was more substantial than his title suggested. NovaCore ran on complexity. 4,000 employees across 7 divisions, domestic and international vendor networks, a facilities infrastructure that had been underfunded for 2 fiscal years and was now catching up with itself in the form of a constant stream of small emergencies. His predecessor had apparently managed by triage alone, letting things sit until they became urgent enough to address. Ethan worked differently. He liked the quieter version of the problem, the one that hadn't become a crisis yet, the one you could solve without theater. He'd also started keeping a second set of notes, not on the company system. A small legal pad, the kind he kept in his jacket pocket, where he wrote down things that didn't have anywhere official to go yet. Account names, dates, contract numbers he'd memorized rather than saved. He didn't know exactly what he was building toward. He just knew that the right thing, sometimes, was to keep a record even when you didn't know yet what the record was for. Mia came back to the office twice more, both times with Carol, Both times because the afternoon schedule had gone sideways in the way that single-parent afternoon schedules had a habit of doing. The second time, Ethan had texted Vanessa's assistant, a careful, measured woman named Lynn, who communicated primarily through precise subject lines and read receipts, to say that he would be receiving a brief family visit and it would not recur. Lynn had responded with, "Ms. Hale is aware." She said the small conference room at the end of the corridor is available if you need the space. Ethan had stared at that message for a moment, then typed back, "Thank you." Mia had spent 20 minutes in the small conference room eating the crackers Carol had packed and drawing a picture of a weather system that was technically for her science project but had evolved, in the way of Mia's drawings, to include a dragon. She had also, without anyone organizing it, ended up in a 10-minute conversation with Vanessa that Ethan had not been present for, because he'd been on a call, and which he'd only heard about afterward in fragments. She knew about isobars, Mia told him on the drive home. What? In weather. She knew what an isobar was. I didn't think grown-ups knew that unless they were teachers. She runs a company, Ethan said. She probably knows a lot of things. She said weather systems are like organizations, Mia said with great seriousness. She said they both fall apart when the pressure gets uneven. A pause. I don't know what that means, but I wrote it down. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Smart woman, he said. Yeah. Mia looked out the window. She looked kind of sad when I left. He didn't have an answer for that. He drove the rest of the way home in the particular quiet that Mia allowed when she sensed something didn't need to be talked about further, and he thought about a 30-year-old woman in a corner office who knew what an isobar was and had told a 7-year-old that organizations fall apart when the pressure gets uneven, and he wondered how much of that had been a lesson in meteorology and how much had been something else. The campaign against Ethan started quietly, the way most effective campaigns do. He didn't recognize it for what it was at first because the individual pieces were small enough to explain away. A vendor call he hadn't been looped in on, even though his name was on the relevant contract, an operations meeting where the agenda had been revised and his item removed, with a note from someone in scheduling that said reorganized per CFO direction. A brief interaction with a board liaison named Gareth, who had stopped by the 14th floor on a Tuesday and asked Ethan with very polished casualness how long he'd been in operations and what his background was in financial systems. I'm not in financial systems, Ethan said. I'm operations. Of course, Gareth said, smiling. Just getting to know the team. After he left, Ethan thought about the question for a while. Then he thought about who had sent Gareth and why, and the cold feeling in his stomach, which had quieted over the past few weeks, came back. He wrote Gareth's name in the legal pad. Under it, he wrote, Tuesday. Financial systems question. Who briefed him? 2 days later, Lynn forwarded him a message that had come through the general 14th floor inbox, addressed him personally to operations support. It was from someone in the legal department asking for clarification on his access to international procurement records and whether it had been formally authorized. The tone was professional. The implication was not. He read it twice. Then he printed it. The one thing he'd printed since the night he found the contracts, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket, and went to knock on the double doors. Vanessa was on a call. He could hear her voice through the door, clipped and focused. He waited. When she opened the door 5 minutes later, she looked at him and immediately looked at the way he was standing, and something in her expression shifted. Come in, she said before he'd said a word. He handed her the printed email. She read it. Her face stayed even. Who sent this to you? She asked. Legal. Someone named Patterson. Patterson reports to the General Counsel. The General Counsel has been close to Damien Cross for 6 years. She set the email on her desk. This is not a legal inquiry. This is positioning. I figured. They're building a paper trail, she said. Unauthorized access to sensitive financial records. It'll look like you were digging for leverage or selling information or... She stopped. How careful were you that night? I didn't save anything to the server, he said. I didn't forward anything. I printed nothing until just now. He paused. But my login is in the access log. That's already there. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. What I've been doing these past weeks, the verification work, it's close, but I need more time. How much time? A week? Maybe 10 days? Ethan thought about the email. He thought about the board liaison's question. He thought about the way these things worked. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in accumulation, the way water finds the cracks you didn't know were there. Cross knows I found something, Ethan said. He's known since the night I accessed those files. Yes. So he's not going to wait 10 days. She held his gaze. No, she said. He's not. The silence in the room had a specific quality, the kind that happens when two people are looking at the same problem from the same angle and neither of them has a clean solution. Ethan had been in rooms like this before. Not in corporate offices, but in the 3 a.m. conversations after the hospital, when the doctors had used words like prognosis and timeline, and he and Carol had sat in a waiting room trying to figure out how to carry something that was too heavy to carry and had to be carried anyway. I'm not going anywhere, he said. Vanessa looked at him with an expression that was careful and complicated, and maybe, underneath it, something quieter. I know, she said. That's the part that worries me. Damien Cross was 51, silver-haired, and the kind of polish that took sustained effort to maintain. He had the handshake of someone who had spent years calibrating exactly how firm to grip and exactly how long to hold it. He smiled often, and the smile never quite reached the part of the face above the cheekbones. He had been CFO of Novacor for 7 years, and in those 7 years had built the kind of institutional influence that is harder to remove than a structural wall, because it's load-bearing in ways that only become visible when you try to take it out. He had also, over those 7 years, moved approximately $9 million through a network of international shell companies that existed only on paper, serviced only invoices, and produced exactly nothing of operational value. He had been careful. He had layered the contracts through legitimate vendor channels, attached them to real projects at early stages, then severed the connection before the project moved to delivery. The numbers were large enough to matter and small enough to miss if you weren't looking. He had been counting on the fact that operations and finance ran on parallel tracks and rarely intersected at the document level. And for 7 years, that had been correct. Ethan Walker had been looking because a facilities request had referenced the wrong contract number, which had led him to a vendor database discrepancy, which had led him to a procurement log that didn't balance, which had led him to stay late on a Thursday to figure out why. He hadn't been looking for Damien Cross. He'd been looking for a missing line item. That was the thing about meticulous dishonesty. It could be undone by ordinary diligence, the unremarkable kind, the kind that didn't make the news. What Damien understood very quickly was that the threat wasn't just Ethan's discovery. The threat was Ethan's proximity to Vanessa, and more specifically the fact that Vanessa appeared to trust him. That was the variable Damien hadn't accounted for. He had expected Vanessa's habitual distance to function as a firewall. She didn't trust people easily. She never had. And a temporary operations hire in a probationary position was exactly the kind of person she would have managed with professional coolness and no deeper investment. It had been true for everyone else who'd sat at that desk. Somehow, it had not been true for this one. He had watched it happen over 6 weeks with the particular attention of someone who monitors threats for a living. The way the corridor conversations lengthened, the way she mentioned Walker in board prep meetings, not prominently, but in the casual way of someone who has absorbed a person into their operational thinking. The way the small conference room had been made available to a man whose daughter had shown up twice with crackers and a dinosaur backpack. Damien had been building his case before Ethan had even finished printing that email. And when Gareth came back to him and reported that Walker's response had been flat and unrevealing, Damien had understood that the man was smarter than average and more careful than he'd hoped, and that the next step needed to be structural rather than interpersonal. He had a contact in IT security, not a contact in the formal sense, a person whose performance review 3 years ago had gone a certain way because of a certain recommendation, and who understood the nature of that kind of debt without it ever needing to be articulated directly. 2 conversations. A few lines of code inserted into a logging system. A set of file access records, time-stamped at 2 in the morning, originating from Ethan Walker's credentials, accessing the company's financial server infrastructure from an external IP. It was clean work, the kind that would look, to anyone reviewing it, like a man who had been careful in the office but sloppy from home, who had covered his tracks at his desk but forgotten that the VPN logs were archived. Damien hadn't moved on it yet. He was waiting for the right moment, the right context, the right audience. Timing, in his experience, was not about being first. It was about being decisive when the room was already prepared to believe you. The board meeting was scheduled for the last Thursday of the month. It was a quarterly review, standard, but this quarter it carried an additional agenda item that had been proposed by 3 board members at Damien's quiet suggestion, a review of executive leadership and organizational focus, which was the kind of phrase that sounded procedural and meant something entirely specific. Ethan found out about it from Dennis, who had a particular gift for knowing things before they were officially knowable, and who appeared at the 14th floor on a Wednesday morning with 2 coffees, which he set on Ethan's desk with the casual care of someone delivering a warning disguised as refreshment. "You didn't hear this from me," Dennis said. "Okay?" The board meeting Thursday. There's a closed session at the end. Cross proposed it. The item is officially organizational efficiency review, but the word going around in the executive admin network is that it's about Vanessa. He paused. Specifically, about whether she's been making decisions influenced by personal attachment to a particular employee. Ethan looked at his coffee. "That's me." "That's you," Dennis confirmed. The argument being that she moved you to the executive floor, gave special access to a temporary hire, allowed repeated personal visits from a family member, and deviated from protocol on at least 2 HR matters. He paused again. "I don't know if any of that is accurate. Some of it's accurate," Ethan said. "Right." Dennis picked up his own coffee. "The thing is, it doesn't need to be the whole story. It just needs to be enough to plant a question mark in the right people's minds. That's how Cross works. He doesn't make accusations. He asks questions." After Dennis left, Ethan sat at his desk for a long time without touching his computer. He thought about what it meant for someone to build a case not by lying, but by selecting. To arrange true things in an order that made them mean something they didn't mean. He thought about how Vanessa would be presented in that closed session. Not as herself, but as a version of herself shaped by a narrative she hadn't been invited to respond to. A woman who had let sentiment cloud her judgment. A leader who had compromised operational integrity for personal reasons. He thought about the fact that what Damien Cross was describing, the proximity, the small adjustments, the access, was real. That was the part that made it effective. It was real, and it could be read 2 ways, and Damien had chosen the reading that served his purpose. He knocked on the double doors before 10. This time Vanessa was at her desk, working, and she looked up without the usual composure-first assessment. She'd been expecting him, he realized, or something like him. "You know about Thursday," he said. "Yes." "It's him." "Yes." He sat down in the chair across from her desk. "What do you want to do?" She looked at him with the expression of someone who has been in this position before. Not this exact one, but the shape of it, the particular geometry of being outmaneuvered by someone who had been planning longer than you'd known the game was being played. She had that look around her eyes of someone who was tired in a way that sleep didn't fix. The kind of tired that came from spending years being twice as prepared as everyone else in the room just to be considered half as capable. "I want to finish the verification," she said. "I have 2 more contract chains to trace. If I can document the full movement of funds before Thursday, I can walk into that board meeting with something that makes his narrative irrelevant. Can you finish it in time?" "I don't know." A pause. "I wasn't expecting him to move this fast." "He moved fast because he's scared," Ethan said. "That's actually useful information." She looked at him. "How is that useful?" "Because scared people make mistakes. They accelerate before they're ready. They use tools that leave traces." He paused. "The IT thing, the access logs he flagged through Patterson, those came from somewhere. Someone helped him generate that. Real access logs don't look like that. I know what my own session data looks like, and the timestamps he's building a case around don't match my schedule." She was very still. "You think he fabricated the digital evidence?" "I think he had someone do it for him, which means there's a seam in it somewhere. There always is." He leaned forward slightly. "If I'm right, and if we can find it before Thursday, you don't just clear my name. You show the board exactly what kind of CFO they've been trusting with their financials for 7 years." The room was quiet. Outside the window, the city moved through its ordinary Wednesday, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "Walker," she said finally. "Yeah. If this goes wrong, if we push on this and he's ready for it, he'll move to have you removed from the building before the board meeting even starts. You won't be there to speak on your own behalf, and the narrative he's built will be the only one in the room." "I know," he said. "You have a daughter. I know that too." She looked at him the way she had in the elevator lobby, like she was trying to work out the math on something that didn't reduce cleanly. "Why?" she said, and it wasn't a rhetorical question. "You could walk away. 90-day probationary position. No one would fault you for—" "Yeah, they would," he said quietly. "I would." She held his gaze for a long time. "Okay," she said. "Then let's find the seam." They worked separately, because working together in the same room with the door closed would have looked exactly like what Damian Cross had told the board it was. Ethan stayed at his desk in the corridor. Vanessa stayed in her office. They communicated through Lynn's email account, not because Lynn was complicit, but because Lynn was meticulous and kept records and operated on a system that didn't route through any of Damian's oversight chains. What Ethan found took him 2 days and felt, when it finally came together, less like a discovery and more like a thing that had been waiting to be seen. The fabricated access logs had been generated by a script. He could tell because the session start times were too consistent. They varied by less than 90 seconds from one to the next, which was not how human behavior worked. Real login patterns were irregular. You came in early some days, late others, you got distracted and your session ran long. You had a meeting and shut everything down at an odd time. These sessions ran like a metronome, and whoever had written the script had been competent but not thorough, and they had not thought to add noise. He wrote the analysis in longhand on his legal pad, 3 pages, precise and documented. He did not type it. He did not put it anywhere digital. On Thursday morning, before the board meeting, he would give those 3 pages to Vanessa directly, and she would decide what to do with them. Vanessa, for her part, had finished the contract chain verification on Tuesday night, working until past midnight, and had sent Ethan a single message through Lynn's account that said, "Full documentation, all 9. We have him." He'd read it sitting at the kitchen table at home, Mia long asleep, the apartment quiet, and he'd felt something in his chest that was not quite relief. Because relief was premature, but was something in that direction. A loosening of the thing that had been braced since the Thursday night he'd stayed late to track down a missing line item and accidentally walked into someone else's crime. He'd turned off his phone and gone to bed, and in the morning made Mia pancakes and listened to her explain, in great detail, the difference between a cold front and an occluded front. And he thought that was a reasonable thing to be an expert in, and that maybe he should know more about weather. Wednesday evening, the day before the board meeting. Ethan was finishing a facilities report that did not need to be finished that night, but that he was finishing anyway because sitting still felt wrong, and his hands needed to be doing something useful while his mind ran the same calculations on a loop. He was the only one left on the 14th floor. Lynn had gone home at 6. The other support staff had trickled out by 7. The building settled into its after-hours quiet, which was a different kind of quiet than daytime. Deeper, less populated, full of small mechanical sounds that the presence of people usually covered. He was about to shut down his computer when his phone buzzed. The message was from a number he didn't recognize, no name, and it said only, "Walker. Don't come in tomorrow. Trust me." He stared at it. He read it 3 more times. Then he set his phone down, because unknown numbers sending warnings the night before a board meeting were not something he was going to act on without knowing who was on the other end, and he went back to his report. His phone buzzed again. Same number. "I work in IT security. I helped Cross build the log files. I didn't know what they were for. I want to fix it." Ethan put his pen down. "Yeah, outside." He sat there in the quiet of the 14th floor, in the building that hummed its ordinary nighttime hum, and he thought about the kind of fear that made people come forward at the last possible moment. Not heroic fear, not clean fear, but the messy kind. The kind that had been sitting on someone's chest for weeks and finally got too heavy. The kind he recognized. He typed back, "What are you offering?" The response took 4 minutes. When it came, it was a screenshot of a server log. Original, unmodified, time-stamped with a different creation date than the fabricated version, metadata intact. The real version of the access records, which showed nothing. Below the screenshot, I kept a copy. I don't know why. I think I knew I'd need it. Ethan looked at this for a long time. Then he forwarded the screenshot to Lynn's account with a subject line that said only, "For Ms. Hale. Tonight if possible." He shut down his computer. He gathered his things. He went to the elevator. In the lobby, he stopped at the security desk and nodded at the overnight guard. A man named Philip, who had been at Novacor for 11 years, and who once told Ethan that the building was like a person. It had good moods and bad ones, and you could tell from the way the vents sounded after midnight. "Night, Mr. Walker," Philip said. "Night, Philip." He paused. "Anything strange today? Anything that seemed off?" Philip thought about it with the seriousness of a man who took his 11 years of atmospheric reading seriously. "Mr. Cross came back in at 9 tonight," he said. "He doesn't usually do that." "No," Ethan said. "He doesn't." He stood there in the lobby for a moment, and the building made a small sound above him. Not the elevator, not the vents. Something else. Something that Philip probably had a name for. Something that the building was saying about itself, the way buildings sometimes did, late at night when the people inside them were about to make decisions they couldn't take back. Ethan walked out into the cold and went home to his daughter. He slept badly, which was not surprising. Ethan lay in the dark of his apartment with the particular wakefulness of someone whose brain had decided that nighttime was actually a very productive period for running worst-case scenarios. And he stared at the ceiling and thought about Philip's 11 years of atmospheric reading, and about Damian Cross returning to the building at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, and about the anonymous IT contact who had kept a copy of something incriminating for reasons they themselves couldn't fully explain. He thought about Mia, asleep in the next room with the nightlight shaped like a crescent moon, that she'd had since she was 3, and refused to give up, even though she told her friends at school she was too old for nightlights. He thought about what it would mean for her if this went wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, not the kind of wrong that showed up in news cycles, but the quieter kind. The kind where a man loses a job under a cloud and the cloud follows him to the next application, and the one after that. And the temporary becomes permanent in all the worst ways. Then he thought about walking away, the way Vanessa had suggested he could. 90-day probationary position. No one would fault you. He'd meant what he said. He would fault himself. And that was the end of the calculation. He was up by 5:30. He made coffee, packed Mia's lunch, and sat at the kitchen table going over the 3 pages of handwritten analysis for what was probably the 4th time, checking his logic the way you check a knot before putting weight on a rope. It held. The seam in the fabricated logs was real, it was documented, and the screenshot from the anonymous IT source, which Vanessa had confirmed receiving via a message from Lynn at 11:14 the previous night that said only Ms. Hale has reviewed and is preparing accordingly, added a second layer of verification that Damian Cross had not been planning for. Carol arrived at 7 to take Mia to school. She came in, looked at Ethan's face, looked at the coffee, and said, "How bad?" "Board meeting today?" he said. "Could go either way." She poured herself a cup without being invited, which was her way of saying she was staying for a few minutes whether he wanted company or not. "You want me to keep Mia tonight, in case it runs late?" "Yeah, if you don't mind." "I don't mind." She drank her coffee. "You know what I think about this job? You think I should have applied somewhere with less drama. I think you applied somewhere that needed exactly the kind of person you are and didn't fully understand what that meant until it was too late to rearrange the furniture." She set down her cup. "Just come home in one piece." Mia appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, hair spectacular with sleep, holding the crescent moon nightlight like she'd carried it out by accident. She looked at Ethan, then at Carol, then at the general atmosphere of the kitchen, which even a 7-year-old could read. "Is it a hard day?" she asked. "Might be," he said, "but I'll pick you up from Carol's tonight, okay?" She considered this with the gravity of someone taking a commitment seriously. Then she put the nightlight on the counter, walked over, and hugged him around the middle with her whole body, the way she'd done since she was small enough to wrap both arms all the way around. He held her for a moment longer than necessary. "Okay," she said. "Don't be late." "I'll try." She went back to her room to get dressed, and the kitchen was quiet, and Ethan finished his coffee and picked up his legal pad and went to work. He arrived on the 14th floor at 7:48 to find it already occupied, not by people, by absence. The kind of absence that tells you something happened recently in the way a room still holds the quality of the last event it hosted. Lynn's desk had papers on it that hadn't been there the night before, stacked with her characteristic precision, but slightly more of them than usual. The door to Vanessa's suite was closed, which was normal for early morning, but the light under the door was on, which meant she'd been there before 7:15. He sat at his desk and opened his computer and spent the first hour doing the ordinary work, because the ordinary work still needed doing regardless of what was happening in the closed session. A vendor escalation from the overnight queue. A facilities request from the 6th floor about a climate control issue in the server room. He answered both and filed a third, and was halfway through a contract renewal flag when Lynn appeared beside his desk with a folder and a look that was more compressed than usual. "She wants to see you before 11, Lynn said. She said bring the legal pad." "Does she need anything else?" "She said bring the legal pad," Lynn repeated, which was Lynn's way of saying that was the whole message and she was not adding editorial commentary. He went in at 10:15. Vanessa was at her desk, but not in the way she usually was. Usually she had her posture, the particular uprightness that she wore like a second garment, the kind that said, "I am in this chair because I choose to be, not because it chose me." This morning she was leaning slightly forward, elbows on the desk, and she looked like someone who had been awake for a long stretch and was running on something other than sleep. She still looked controlled, but underneath the control was something thin. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He put the legal pad on the desk between them. She looked at it. "Is it solid?" "Yes." "Walk me through it." He did. 3 pages, 12 minutes, every line of the analysis. She listened without interrupting, which was how she listened when something mattered. Not silently exactly, but with a very specific quality of attention that communicated she was tracking every word and filing it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The session regularity," she said, 90 seconds variance, that's your strongest point. And the creation timestamp on the original log that the IT source provided. That's independent corroboration. 2 things together are harder to dismiss than one. Damien will say the IT source is fabricating the screenshot. He can say that, but the metadata is intact and verifiable, and the source is willing to give a formal statement. People who fabricate evidence don't usually keep the original. He paused. Also, willing to testify is different from testifying comfortably. This person is scared. If we use them, we need to move fast before they reconsider. Vanessa nodded slowly. She looked at her own documentation, spread across the left side of her desk. Pages of contract analysis, account traces, the financial architecture of 7 years of careful theft. $9 million. 43 separate transactions. 6 shell companies that did not exist as anything other than names in a legal database. "I've been building this case for 6 weeks, she said, and I still don't know if it's enough." "It's enough," Ethan said. "The question is whether the board will let us present it before Cross presents his." She looked at him. "The closed session is at 2. He controls the framing because he proposed the item. That means he goes first. Then we need someone in the room who knows what's coming and can slow it down long enough for you to respond." He paused. "Do you have anyone on the board? Someone who's been watching Cross with questions they haven't asked yet?" She thought about it. "Margaret Chen," she said finally. "She's asked about international vendor performance twice in the last 2 quarters. Cross answered her smoothly both times, but she didn't stop watching." "Can you reach her before 2? "I can try. Don't tell her everything, just enough that she knows to buy you time." Vanessa looked at him with the expression she sometimes got when she was recalibrating something internally. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the small shift of a person who has updated their understanding of another person by a meaningful increment. "You've done this before," she said. "Not this specifically, but something like this." "Not like this," he said. "But I've been in situations where someone with more institutional power was trying to do something wrong, and I had to figure out what I could do about it from where I was standing." He paused. "Usually it was smaller than this." "What did you do?" "Usually I tried to document everything and tell the truth and trust that the truth was findable if someone looked." A pause. "Sometimes it worked." She held his gaze. And when it didn't, I still slept okay, he said. Mostly. She almost smiled. It wasn't the crescent moon nightlight version of an almost smile. It was something quieter and more complicated, like a door opening a few inches in a room that had been sealed for a long time. All right, she said. I'll reach out to Margaret. You go back to your desk. Don't do anything that looks reactive. And Walker, yeah. Thank you, she said, for the legal pad. He understood that the legal pad was not the only thing she was thanking him for, and he understood why she'd chosen to frame it that way, and he nodded once and went back to his desk. The afternoon was the kind of slow that felt like something pressing against you from the other side of a wall. At 12:40, the citywide emergency alert system issued a test notification, which everyone's phones received simultaneously and which caused the particular brief collective startle that mass alerts always produced. Ethan checked the notification, confirmed it was a test, and went back to work. Outside the windows, the sky had gone the color of old pewter, and the weather system that had been building offshore for 2 days was finally making its approach. The forecast had said possible thunderstorms by evening. Mia would have called it a warm sector occlusion and explained it with great seriousness to whoever was in the room. At 1:15, the lights flickered. Not for long, just a brief dip, the kind that happens when the grid is carrying more than it likes, and then they came back and everything continued. But Ethan noticed it, and he noticed that the building's backup systems made a small confirming sound, and he noted it the way you note small things when you've been operating in a heightened state of attention. At 1:45, he saw Vanessa leave for the boardroom. She came through the corridor in the way she moved when she was fully composed and fully focused, which was a specific kind of forward momentum that left no room for interpretation. She had her tablet. She had the folder of documentation. She did not look at his desk when she passed, which he understood was deliberate. Looking would have been a tell, and she was too smart for tells. He watched her go, then he turned back to his screen. The board meeting started at 2. He had no way of knowing what was happening in that room. He had no access to it, no proxy inside it, no feed. He had done what he could do from where he was standing, and the rest was not in his hands, and he understood that intellectually. He was still staring at the same vendor escalation email at 2:47 when every light in the building went out. Not a flicker this time. A full, complete, instantaneous blackout. The kind where one moment there is light and sound and the low, constant electrical presence of a functioning building, and the next moment there is nothing. The emergency lighting kicked in after about 8 seconds, red-edged and directional, casting the 14th floor in the particular flat illumination of crisis protocols. The computer screens were dark. The elevators, Ethan knew immediately, were locked. The building's intercom system made a single clipped tone and then went silent. He stood up. He went to the window. Below, the city was dark in a wide radius, not everywhere, but in a band that included Novacor's block and several surrounding ones. Streetlights out, traffic signals out. The few cars visible were navigating on headlights alone, cautiously, through intersections that had suddenly become negotiated rather than regulated. His phone had signal. He checked it immediately. The citywide emergency system had issued a new alert, not a test this time. Unplanned power disruption affecting sectors 7 through 12. Emergency services active. Duration unknown. He called Vanessa's mobile. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called the boardroom's direct line. Silence. No ring, no tone. The internal phone system was down. He went to Lynn's desk. Lynn had already gone to the stairwell, following the evacuation protocol that building management had automatically triggered when the power dropped. The 14th floor was emptying the way floors emptied in orderly evacuations, with purpose, with the sound of footsteps on stairs, with the residual noise of people who had done the drill before and trusted the drill. Ethan counted the people he could see. He counted the people moving toward the stairwell. He calculated who was not among them. The board meeting had been in the executive conference room on the 14th floor's east wing, which was on the far side of the double doors, which had auto-locking security panels that, when the power dropped, defaulted to lockdown mode rather than releasing. It was a security protocol, the kind designed to protect sensitive spaces during power disruptions. He knew this because he had read the building operations manual, all of it, including the security addendum, because that was how he operated. He also knew that the lockdown override required a code entered at the panel, and the panel ran on building power, and the building power was currently off, and the battery backup for the security panels had a 6-hour rating, which meant they were locked for at least 6 hours unless the main power came back. He knew one more thing. Vanessa Hale had been in that conference room when the power dropped. He tried her phone again. Voicemail. He tried the East Wing panel code from memory. He'd been given administrative access months ago for operational reasons. The panel made a sound indicating the code had registered, but the lock was in override mode and would not release. The battery backup was doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was the problem. In the stairwell behind him, the building evacuation was proceeding. People were moving down, out, toward the street. A building security officer appeared at the stairwell entrance and told Ethan in a firm, practiced voice that the floor needed to be cleared immediately and that he needed to proceed to the ground level. "There are people in the East Wing," Ethan said. "Emergency services have been notified. Building management is coordinating. You need to clear the floor, sir. The security lock on the East Wing is in battery override. It won't release without the main power." "Sir, who has the manual override for the battery backup systems?" The security officer's radio crackled. He held up a hand, listened, said something short, and clipped into the radio, then looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who is receiving information that is changing the shape of the situation. "What's your name?" "Walker. Ethan Walker. Operations." "Walker." Yeah, something shifted in the officer's face. "The board conference room. You think there are people locked in?" "One person, possibly two." He paused. "The CEO." What happened next was not efficient or clean or cinematic in the way emergency responses were supposed to be. It was confusing in the way real emergencies were confusing. Multiple voices on radios, information that arrived incomplete and was updated before it could be acted on. The particular institutional friction of a building in partial chaos, trying to figure out which protocols applied when multiple systems had failed simultaneously. Emergency services were en route. Building management had a team working on the power restoration from the basement level. The structural lockdown on the East Wing was confirmed. 3 rooms, including the executive conference room and the adjacent storage space. Occupancy was unknown because the personnel tracking system ran on the same power grid. Ethan found the building's facilities manager, a man named Rogers, who had been at Novacor for 14 years and who kept a laminated copy of every building system diagram in a folder in his office, which he was currently carrying under his arm in the stairwell because that was apparently what you did after 14 years. "The maintenance tunnel," Ethan said. "The one under the East Wing. It accesses the utility infrastructure for that corridor." Rogers looked at him. "How do you know about the maintenance tunnel?" "I read the building operations manual." "The whole manual?" "Yes." Rogers opened his folder. He found the page, a cross-section diagram of the subterranean utility access network, which had been built in the original construction phase and used primarily for HVAC and electrical routing, and, Rogers confirmed, had a vertical access shaft that came up inside the East Wing's maintenance closet, which was on the other side of the security lockdown but accessible from below. "The shaft is not meant for human access," Rogers said. "It's 40 feet. It's not rated—" "I know." Ethan was already looking at the diagram. "Is it structurally stable?" "In a blackout, I can't verify. Best estimate." Rogers looked at the diagram for a moment. "The main structure is reinforced concrete. It should be fine. The utility runs inside it are what I can't verify." He paused. "There's also a ventilation fan in the shaft that might or might not be running on backup power." "Where's the access hatch?" Rogers hesitated. He was a man in a genuinely difficult position. The position of someone who knew that saying yes was a liability and saying no was also a liability, and that the person asking him was not going to be deterred by either answer, and that somewhere on the other side of the locked East Wing there was a person who might need help. He pointed to the diagram. "Basement level 2. Maintenance corridor C. The hatch is behind the secondary electrical panel." Basement level 2 smelled like concrete and old metal and the particular smell of machinery that has been running for years without stopping. The emergency lighting down here was even more minimal than upstairs. Single red strips at floor level, just enough to move by, not enough to see clearly. Ethan had his phone flashlight and the page from Rogers's diagram that Rogers had torn out and handed to him without a word before Ethan had turned and gone to the stairwell. The maintenance corridor was narrow, shoulder width, maybe slightly less. The pipes and conduits running along the ceiling forced him to move with his head at an angle, and twice he miscalculated and hit something cold and metal with his shoulder. He was moving fast, faster than was comfortable in the dark, because somewhere above him there was a woman who had been in a locked room for approximately 20 minutes and whose phone was not answering, and his brain was producing scenarios for why it might not be answering that he was not finding useful. He found the secondary electrical panel. Behind it, partially obscured by a junction box that had been installed without much thought for what was behind it, the hatch was exactly where the diagram said it would be. It was not large. It was the kind of opening that building engineers designed for equipment access, not for people, roughly 20 inches square, with a latch mechanism that required a specific wrench size and which Ethan had to improvise on with a piece of conduit he found on the floor, working by phone light, his hands not entirely steady. The latch gave after about 4 minutes. He looked up into the shaft. His phone light showed a vertical tube of concrete and metal, approximately 40 feet, with iron rungs set into the wall at roughly 18-inch intervals. The rungs were old. Some had surface rust. The shaft smelled like electrical systems and confined space, and somewhere up there, distantly, moving air. The ventilation fan Rogers had mentioned was not, apparently, on backup power. That was one problem off the list. He put his phone in his jacket pocket, tested the first rung with both hands, felt it hold, and started to climb. But the shaft was not a place for a person, and it communicated this clearly. The walls were closer than they looked from below, close enough that his shoulders brushed both sides in some stretches, and in one section, where a conduit had been rerouted sometime in the building's history and now cut across the available space at an angle, he had to turn sideways and feed himself through a gap that required him to breathe out and commit fully. The rung below the conduit was loose. He found out when he put his weight on it and felt it shift, and he caught himself on the rung above by reflex, hanging for a second with his forearms braced against the wall and his heart doing something aggressive. And then he redistributed his weight and kept going. 30 feet up, he heard something. He stopped. He held completely still. The shaft amplified sound the way pipes did, distorted but directional. Above him, through the access hatch at the top, he could hear the sound of something shifting, mechanical, the kind of sound that a building makes when its structural elements are experiencing stress they weren't designed for. And beneath that, just audible, the sound of someone's voice. He climbed the last 10 feet faster than was wise. The hatch at the top had a different mechanism, a push bar, emergency access style, designed to open from below. He hit it with both palms, and it gave. And he came up through the floor of the East Wing maintenance closet into the dark in a state of significant physical disrepair, scraped, dusty, one elbow bleeding from the conduit encounter, and he pushed the closet door open into the corridor. The East Wing emergency lighting was functioning. The corridor was empty, and from the direction of the executive conference room 20 feet to his left, he heard Vanessa's voice say, with controlled precision, something that sounded like a number, a countdown, or an estimate. He moved to the conference room door. It was closed but not locked from this side. The security lockdown only prevented external entry, not internal exit. He opened it. Vanessa was in the far corner of the room, away from the windows, her phone face up on the table showing a flashlight app that was the only light source. She had wheeled her chair to a position away from the section of ceiling that had shed a ceiling tile. There was a tile on the floor near the center of the table, evidence of whatever structural complaint the building had made when the power systems failed, and she was holding her tablet like she'd been using it to track something. She looked at him when he came through the door. He looked at her. She looked at his elbow. "You're bleeding." "It's nothing." He came in and closed the door behind him. "You okay?" "Define okay." She set the tablet down. The ceiling gave up one tile. The door wouldn't open when the power dropped. "My phone lost signal about 8 minutes ago. I think the backup antenna for this wing is on the same circuit as the primary." She looked at him with an expression that had a lot in it, none of it simple. "How did you get in here?" "Maintenance tunnel, 40-foot shaft in the basement." She was quiet for a moment. "Rogers told you about that?" "He showed me the diagram." And you climbed up a 40-foot utility shaft in the dark. The emergency lighting helped, down low. A pause. The ventilation fan was off, which was good. The fourth rung from the top was loose. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the lobby on his first day, except this time the expression had more layers to it, more history. And the professional distance that had been its outermost layer was, at the moment, not present. Why? She said. It was the same question she'd asked him in the office, about the board meeting, about staying, and it was the same question underneath it, the real one, the one that wasn't about tactics. You were up here, he said. It was the simplest version of the answer, and it was accurate, and he figured the simplest version was probably the right one. She looked at him for a long moment. The room was dark except for the tablet light, and somewhere in the building's infrastructure, something was making a sound like stress looking for a path, and both of them were sitting with the specific intimacy of people who have been stripped of the usual protective layers by circumstance. No desk between them, no 14-floor protocols, no performance of professional distance. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay. She looked at the table for a moment. When she looked back up, her expression was the kind that someone has when they have been practicing. Not saying something for so long that finally saying it feels structurally risky, like removing the load-bearing wall and hoping the ceiling holds. I have spent 3 years building this company into something that works. After the accident, after everything. And I did it by deciding that the only reliable variable was myself, that people were approximate, that closeness was a liability, that if I made myself sufficient, I wouldn't need anyone to stay. He didn't say anything. The room held what she was saying. Your daughter asked me once if I preferred to push my own chair because then I could go wherever I wanted. She paused. I told her yes. But the truth is, I push my own chair because I stopped believing anyone would choose to push it with me. Not out of obligation, not out of transaction, just because they wanted to be going the same direction. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside the conference room, the building made another sound, deeper this time, followed by the distant echo of emergency services in the stairwell. Someone was working the building's systems from below. Vanessa, he said. I know, she said, cutting him off gently. I know it's not the time. I know the board meeting got interrupted and Cross is probably down there right now trying to figure out how to use this, and I know this is the least strategic conversation I could be having. A beat. I just needed to say it, while there's no desk in the way. He looked at her. In the flat emergency light, she looked like a person who had been very alone for a long time and had made a kind of peace with it that was functional but not comfortable, and who was sitting across from someone she hadn't planned for and couldn't quite make fit into the system she'd built, and who had decided, maybe 15 minutes into a power blackout in a locked room, that the system needed revising. Real strength, he said quietly, isn't measured by whether someone can walk. She looked at him sharply. It's measured by loyalty, he said. That's not a strategy. It's just true. She held his gaze for a long time. The tablet light was steady between them. Somewhere below, the building's emergency systems were coming back online, piece by piece, the way things that have been broken work their way back. Not all at once, and not without effort, but directionally. Forward. The board meeting, she said. It'll reconvene, he said. We have everything we need. Cross will have used the disruption. Probably, but we have the documentation, and we have the IT source, and we have the fabricated log analysis, and now we have the context of whatever he did to trigger this blackout. He paused and looked at her steadily. Because I don't think a citywide grid failure on the night before your board meeting is a coincidence. Her eyes changed. Not surprise exactly. More like the confirmation of a thing she had already suspected, but hadn't let herself say. The emergency systems, she said slowly. He was in the building at 9 last night, Ethan said. Philip told me. Cross never comes back at 9. She was quiet, and then she made a sound that was short and controlled, and carried in it the compressed quality of someone who has just understood the full architecture of what was done to them. He tried to trap me, she said. He needed me out of the boardroom. He needed the meeting to be disrupted before I could respond to his presentation. And he needed it to look like infrastructure failure, Ethan said. not sabotage. But if the security footage from the basement level is on backup, it is, he said. Rogers mentioned it. The backup servers are on a separate circuit. The building shuddered again, and then, with the particular abruptness of systems that fail and recover in a binary way, the lights came on. Not all of them, not at full strength. But the main power was back, partial, cycling up, and the overhead lights in the conference room kicked on at half brightness, and the security panel on the door beeped once, processing, and then the lock released with a clean mechanical sound. Ethan stood up. Vanessa put her hands on her wheels and looked at the door. And then she looked at him, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it. Not unguarded, exactly, because she was not a person who did unguarded, but honest in a way that honest people were when they had decided to stop performing the alternative. "Walker," she said. "Yeah. When this is over." She let the sentence complete itself in the space between them, which was a specific kind of communication that required two people who were paying attention, and they were both paying attention. "Yeah," he said again quietly. He went to the door and opened it, and the corridor was there, and the emergency lighting was supplemented now by the returning main power. And somewhere below them the building was reassembling itself from its failure, and there were things that still had to be done. Evidence to secure, a board meeting to reconvene, a man who had spent the last 2 hours very confident in his plan and who was about to discover that the ceiling tile he hadn't accounted for was the one with Ethan Walker's name on it. He held the door open. She wheeled through it. They went down to the lobby together, and neither of them said anything else, because some things don't need to be finished in words, and they had several hours of very complicated work ahead of them, and Mia was at Carol's waiting for him to not be late. He was going to try very hard not to be late. The lobby was controlled chaos, which was better than uncontrolled chaos, but not by the margin you'd hope for. 3 fire department units had arrived during the blackout and were working through the building floor by floor in the systematic way of people who have done this enough times that urgency and procedure are not in conflict for them. A police unit was managing the street perimeter. Building management had set up a coordination point near the security desk where Rogers was standing with his laminated folder, fielding questions from 2 different emergency responders simultaneously with the focused calm of a man who had been through 14 years of building emergencies and had developed a personal philosophy about them. Ethan and Vanessa came out of the stairwell into this, and for a moment the lobby absorbed them into its chaos without fanfare. Just 2 more people emerging from a stairwell in a building that was working through a power disruption. Then a firefighter doing a head count registered Vanessa, cross-referenced something on a clipboard, and said something into his radio, and 3 seconds later the quality of the room shifted as people realized the person they'd been trying to locate was standing in front of them. Ms. Hale, the incident commander, a wide-shouldered woman who communicated primarily in declarative sentences, materialized at Vanessa's side. "We had you listed as unaccounted for." I was in the East Wing," Vanessa said. "The security lockdown held. Anyone else up there?" "Just me." She glanced at Ethan, and the glance lasted exactly long enough to say something that the room didn't need to hear. "Mr. Walker came up through the maintenance shaft." The incident commander looked at Ethan, looked at his elbow, which had stopped bleeding but had done nothing to become less visible, looked back at Vanessa, made a decision about what kind of situation this was. "Building management needs a full account for the incident report," she said, "and you should have someone look at that." "I'm fine," Ethan said. "The arm," she said, in the tone of someone not making a suggestion. A paramedic appeared. Ethan submitted to the examination with the resigned patience of a man who understood that arguing with paramedics was its own form of inefficiency. The cut on his elbow was cleaned and covered in approximately 4 minutes. During those 4 minutes, he watched the lobby and thought about everything that needed to happen in the next several hours and the order in which it needed to happen. He also thought about Damian Cross, who was somewhere in this building or just outside it, and who had spent the last 2 hours operating on the assumption that his plan had worked. Rogers found Ethan at the paramedic station. He leaned in close in the specific way of someone with information they're not comfortable broadcasting. "Backup servers," he said quietly. "East Wing basement. They're on the separate circuit you mentioned to me. I checked them when the main power started cycling back." "Are they intact?" "Running. Everything from tonight. Time-stamped, continuous recording. He paused. I also found something at the main emergency panel in basement level 1. A bypass. Manual. Someone inserted a physical override on the load distribution system. It's the kind of thing that would cascade into a controlled blackout if activated at the right moment. Ethan looked at him. A physical override, not a software failure. Not a software failure, Rogers confirmed. Someone had to be in that basement and had to know exactly which panel to access and exactly how to set it. He folded his hands around his folder. I've been in this building 14 years. That panel is not something a random person finds. Who has access to basement level 1? Executive level badge access, 6 people. He paused. Mr. Cross is one of them. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Rogers, can you hold that information, the bypass, until I tell you where to take it? Rogers looked at him with the expression of someone calculating the weight of what they're being asked to hold. How long? A few hours, maybe less. A pause. Rogers looked at his folder, which contained the diagram of a building he'd watched for 14 years, and apparently he made some version of the same calculation that Ethan had made at the kitchen table at 5:30 that morning, the one about what you could live with and what you couldn't. A few hours, he said. Then I'm going to the incident commander regardless. That's fair, Ethan said. Chumps. Vanessa had moved to a quieter corner of the lobby and was on her phone, which had recovered its signal once the primary antenna came back online with the partial power restoration. She was talking to someone in a measured, factual voice that Ethan recognized as her operational register, the one she used when she was managing multiple problems simultaneously and didn't want any of them to know about the others. She ended the call when he approached. Margaret Chen, she said. She's here. She was in the building for the board meeting when the power dropped and she stayed. A pause. I told her we needed to reconvene. Tonight, if possible. Is that possible? Margaret says yes, she's already contacted 4 of the other board members. The only one who isn't responding is Gareth. She looked at Ethan with flat eyes. Gareth, who is Cross's board liaison. Where's Cross? Last seen in the lobby approximately 20 minutes ago. He told the incident coordinator he needed to retrieve materials from his office and went back upstairs. She paused. His office is on the 12th floor, not the east wing. The 12th floor was never locked down. Ethan thought about this. He's cleaning up, he said. Whatever he left up there that he doesn't want found. Yes. Then we need someone in that office before he is. She looked at him steadily. I've already called internal security. Phillips from overnight, the one you trust. He's on the 12th floor now. A beat. I told him to hold the space pending an internal security review and not to let anyone in without my direct authorization. Ethan looked at her. When did you call Phillips? Approximately 4 minutes after the lights came back on. She held his gaze with the particular composure of someone who had spent 20 minutes alone in a locked, dark room, recalibrating, and had emerged from it sharper than when she went in, not softer. I've been running this company for 3 years, Walker. I know how to move when I have something to work with. Yeah, he said. You do. Something in the way he said it made her pause for just a moment, and then she turned back to her phone. The board meeting, 9 o'clock. Main conference room on 8. It's fully powered, separate circuit. Margaret is setting it up. She looked at him. I need you there. I'll be there. As a witness, she said, to the log analysis, and to what Rogers found in the basement. She paused. And because I need someone in that room who isn't afraid of Damien Cross. He thought about saying that he wasn't exactly unafraid, that fear was a reasonable response to a man who had just engineered a building blackout and planted digital evidence and spent 6 weeks methodically constructing a case against him. He thought about saying that bravery and fearlessness were different things, and he'd always been more comfortable with the first category than the second. Instead, he said, I'll bring the legal pad. Oh. The 9 o'clock board meeting was not the board meeting anyone had planned for that day. The room on the 8th floor held 9 people when it was full, and it held 7 tonight. Margaret Chen at the head of the table, 5 other board members who had made their way back to the building through the edge of a storm that had arrived while the emergency response was still winding down outside. And Vanessa at the far end, documents open in front of her, with Ethan in the chair along the wall behind her that was technically for support staff, and that felt, tonight, like exactly the right position to be in. Damian Cross was not present. He had been escorted to a holding room on the third floor by two members of internal security on Vanessa's authorization, pending the presentation of evidence that had been formally flagged to the board chair. Margaret, as it happened, who had been waiting for a reason to ask the question she'd been asking since the second quarter, 40 minutes earlier. He had not gone quietly. There had been raised voices on the 12th floor that Phillips had documented. There had been a phone call to the general counsel that had been intercepted by IT security, the same IT security team whose cooperation Vanessa had been quietly building for 3 weeks, and logged. He had said, at one point, according to Phillips, that this was a coordinated attack on his reputation by an emotionally compromised CEO and a temporary employee with no standing in the organization. Phillips had written that down verbatim because Phillips was thorough. The board meeting began at 9:14 because 2 board members arrived late from the street and needed a few minutes to decompress from the evening. Margaret ran it the way she ran everything, according to Dennis, who had been at Novacor long enough to have attended several Margaret Chen-chaired meetings, and who had described her to Ethan once as the kind of person who treats information like a surgeon treats an instrument, picks up exactly what she needs, and puts down exactly what she doesn't. "We're here because the day's events require a full account," Margaret said, "and because several matters have been brought to the board's attention that were already pending before tonight added its own complications." She looked around the table. "Vanessa, start from the beginning." Vanessa started from the beginning. She was not perfect in that room. That was the thing that Ethan noticed, and that he thought later mattered more than almost anything else. She did not deliver a polished presentation. She stumbled once early on when she was describing the first week of the investigation, and she said something about trust and then stopped and restarted the sentence in a different direction, and the room waited, and she continued. She lost her page once in the financial documentation and had to spend 30 seconds finding the right contract chain while 5 board members watched. She was not invincible. She did not pretend to be. What she was honest, and she had the receipts. She walked them through the contract architecture. 43 transactions, 6 shell companies, $9 million over 7 years. The entire infrastructure of it laid out in documents that had been prepared with the specificity of someone who understood that the difference between an accusation and a case was precision. She walked them through the fabricated log files, Ethan's handwritten analysis, presented and explained, the 90-second session variants, the metadata contradictions, the independent verification from the IT source, whose written statement had been notarized that afternoon by a legal contact Vanessa had reached during the 2 hours while the building was still sorting itself out. She walked them through the physical bypass Rogers had found in basement level 1, the executive badge access record showing Cross's entry to the building at 9 o'clock the previous evening and again at 11:30, the security footage from the backup servers showing a figure in the basement corridor at 11:47. The footage was not perfect, the angle was partial, the figure was not visible from the front, but the badge access log and the footage timestamp were the same, and the figure moved with the particular purposeful directness of someone who knew where they were going, and the specific panel they stopped at was the panel with the manually inserted bypass, and after 7 seconds at the panel, the figure walked away and the bypass was in place. Margaret looked at the footage for a long time after it played. Then she looked at the board. Then she looked at Vanessa. "The board needs to discuss this," she said. "We'll take a short recess." Vanessa looked at her steadily. "I'd like to say one more thing before you do." Margaret nodded. Vanessa set down her tablet. She folded her hands on the table in front of her, and she looked at the people around it, some of whom she had been working with for 3 years, some of whom had voted to give her the CEO position, and some of whom had been skeptical of that vote, some of whom had been in Damian Cross's orbit long enough to have a complicated relationship with this evening. "I know what the original agenda item for today's closed session was," she said. "I know what questions were being raised about my judgment and my objectivity." She paused. "Some of those questions were based on things that are true. I did move Ethan Walker to the executive floor outside standard protocol. I did give him access to operational records beyond the scope of his listed position. I did make room for his daughter in the building twice when that wasn't standard either." Another pause. "Those decisions were not mistakes. They were judgments. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise, because the person who never makes a judgment call that looks unusual from the outside is either operating in a very simple environment or is not actually making decisions. The room was quiet. What I want to say, she continued, and her voice was level but not flat. There was something in it that wasn't there at the beginning of the meeting, something that was neither performance nor professionalism, but just a person speaking from the part of themselves that had been in a dark, locked room for 20 minutes and had decided that the performance was the most expensive thing in the building. Is that I spent a long time believing that strength meant not needing anyone, that the only safe way to run something was to keep everything at the distance where it could be managed. And I was wrong, not about rigor, not about standards, but about the idea that trust is a liability. She looked at Margaret. Ethan Walker found the financial discrepancy because he was good at his job and he cared about doing it right. He came up a 40-foot maintenance shaft in the dark because I was in that room, and he didn't think about it first. He just came. That's not a conflict of interest. That's the kind of person you want making decisions in your organization. A beat. I should have said that before tonight. I'm saying it now. The recess lasted 22 minutes. Well, Ethan spent those 22 minutes in the hallway outside the conference room, sitting in a chair along the wall with his jacket off and his rolled-up sleeve showing the paramedic's bandage on his elbow, looking at his phone. He had 3 messages from Carol. The first said, "How's it going?" The second said, "Mia made pasta at my place and saved you some." The third, from 40 minutes ago, said, "She's asleep. Come when you're done. Don't rush." He looked at the third message for a while. Then he put his phone away and sat with the specific quality of exhaustion that came not from physical effort alone, but from hours of sustained alertness finally beginning to release. The kind where your body starts taking stock of everything it set aside in the interest of keeping up with events. The door opened. Margaret Chen came out. She was a small woman, precise in her movements, and she had the particular calm of someone who had been in rooms where significant decisions were made often enough that the significance no longer made her nervous. She looked at Ethan in the chair, at the bandage on his elbow, at the legal pad in his lap, and she said, "You read the whole operations manual?" "Yes." "Including the maintenance tunnel section?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "I've been on this board for 5 years. In that time, I have watched Damian Cross answer my questions about international vendor performance with the kind of fluency that, in retrospect, I should have recognized as the fluency of someone who has rehearsed the answer rather than someone who knows the material." She paused. "I want you to know that the board is not entirely composed of people who were waiting to be told what to think. Some of us were waiting for someone to bring us something we could act on." "I know," he said. "Vanessa knew that too." "Yes, she did." Another pause. "She also knew it about you, I think. Earlier than she'd probably admit." She looked down the hallway. "We'll be back in 5 minutes." She went back inside. Ethan looked at the legal pad. He thought about the first day. The lobby, the elevator, the sound of something mechanical deciding to give up. He thought about a desk in a corridor outside a double door, and a floor lamp 18 inches in the wrong position, and a 7-year-old who thought you could be both serious and nice, and who had explained weather systems to a CEO in a conference room and apparently made an impression that outlasted the explanation. He thought about the way Vanessa had said when this is over in a dark room, and the specific unhurried weight of those 3 words and what they contained. He thought about Mia's pasta, wrapped in foil at Carol's, getting cold. The board reconvened. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. Damian Cross was formally suspended from his position pending criminal investigation, effective immediately, with the board's unanimous vote recorded at 10:11. The suspension carried a standard non-disclosure provision and an immediate revocation of all building access, which meant Phillips, still on the 12th floor, received the authorization to formally seal the office within minutes of the vote. The charges against Ethan, the fabricated access logs, the unauthorized access claim, the entire paper trail that Patterson had been quietly building at Cross's direction, were formally reviewed, documented as fabricated, and expunged from his personnel file. Margaret read the resolution aloud in the specific formal register of board proceedings, and Ethan, sitting along the wall in the support staff chair, listened to his own name being cleared in the language of institutional record, and felt something in his chest do a specific thing that was not dramatic and not cinematic, but was real. A loosening, like something that had been holding its breath for 6 weeks, finally stopped. The general counsel, who had been in the room for the last 30 minutes at Margaret's invitation, and whose complicated relationship with Cross's orbit had apparently resolved itself quickly once the evidentiary weight became clear, said that the firm would be conducting an internal review of all external legal communications over the past quarter. He said this in a tone that communicated awareness of his own exposure. Margaret acknowledged it without warmth. Vanessa said very little during the board's deliberations. She answered specific questions precisely, and didn't fill the silences that weren't hers to fill. When the vote on Cross's suspension was called, she kept her face even. Not because she wasn't feeling anything, Ethan suspected, but because she'd learned a long time ago to let the room do what it was going to do without her reaction becoming part of the record. After the vote, when Margaret formally moved to close the emergency session, Vanessa said, "One more item." Margaret looked at her. "The board was presented today with a question about my judgment and my fitness to lead this company." She looked around the table. "I want that question formally answered in the record, not just set aside because a larger problem appeared. I want the board to vote on whether they have confidence in my continued leadership." A pause moved through the room. Not uncomfortable exactly, but substantive. The kind that happens when someone does something that wasn't required, and that required a form of courage that the formal proceedings hadn't created room for. Margaret looked at the board. "Motion on the floor," she said. "Confidence in the current CEO." The vote was 6-0. Gareth, who remained unaccounted for that evening, and whose absence from the building had by now taken on its own investigative coloring, did not cast a vote. 6-0. Unanimous, minus the absence. Vanessa looked at the record. She didn't say thank you, not because she wasn't grateful, but because thank you in that room at that moment would have reduced something that was larger than gratitude. She said, "I appreciate the board's confidence. I'll work to deserve it." And that was the end of the meeting. Chab. The building was quiet by 11. The emergency response had fully cleared. The storm had moved through during the board session and left the street outside wet and relieved looking, the way streets did after a rain that had been building for days. The air outside was cooler than it had been in weeks. Ethan was in the lobby putting his jacket on when Vanessa came out of the elevator. She had her bag in her lap and her tablet in the folder of documentation, and she looked like a person who had done something very hard and was on the other side of it and hadn't fully processed yet what the other side felt like. She stopped beside him. "How's the elbow?" she said. "Fine. The paramedic used a lot of tape." "That's how you know they're thorough." She paused. "Mia is at Carol's." "Yeah, I'm going now." He paused. "She made pasta." "Go," she said. "She waited up for you." Carol said she's asleep. "She made pasta for you, and she said she was going to sleep." Vanessa looked at him with the dry, specific humor of someone who has spent recent time with a 7-year-old and has recalibrated accordingly. "She's not asleep." He almost laughed. He pulled his jacket straight, which was not entirely necessary but gave his hands something to do, and he looked at her in the lobby. The same lobby where 6 weeks ago a chair had rolled backward toward an open shaft, and he dropped his folder and crossed the room without thinking. And he thought about how much had happened in the space between that moment and this one, and how neither of them had planned any of it, and how that was not the comfort it should have been, but was somehow still a comfort. "Vanessa," he said. "I know," she said. "Go." "I'll be in at 8. 7:50. A pause. "The floor lamp is still 18 inches to the left. I'd like that verified." "It's been in the right position for 6 weeks. "Humor me," she said, and there it was again. That not-quite smile that lived in the territory just before a smile, except this time it got a little further than usual, and for a moment the lobby had a quality that lobbies rarely had, which was warmth. He went out through the revolving door into the wet night air and walked to his car and sat in it for a minute with the windows down, letting the post-storm cool come in. The city around him was reconstituting itself from the blackout. Lights on in most windows now, traffic moving normally. The ordinary machinery of a city at night running on its ordinary schedule, indifferent and enormous and somehow, tonight, not hostile. He thought about Mia's pasta. He thought about Carol's third message, "Come when you're done, don't rush." He thought about the way Vanessa had said go, not like a dismissal, but like a person who understood what he was going home to and respected the weight of it. He started the car. Carol's apartment was 12 minutes away, and when he knocked on the door at 11:38, she opened it with the look of someone who had been awake and reading but had decided not to make a point of it. She looked at his elbow. She looked at his face. She stepped back and let him in. The kitchen smelled like the pasta, which was covered in foil on the stove on low, as she had apparently maintained it against the reasonable possibility that he would arrive late and hungry, which was an act of Carol-style love that did not announce itself as such. "How'd it go, Shay?" she said. "It went," he said. She made a sound that was its own complete sentence. Then she said, "She is technically asleep. She lasted until 11. She made you leave some pasta, and she told me to tell you—" Carol paused in the way of someone recounting a 7-year-old's instructions with appropriate fidelity. "That she loves you, and she knew you wouldn't be late, even if you were late." He stood in Carol's kitchen for a moment with that. "That tracks," he said. "Yeah." Carol handed him a fork. "Eat, then go look in on her. She's got the nightlight on." He ate standing at the kitchen counter, which was not civilized but was honest, and the pasta was good. Slightly overcooked the way Mia made things, with too much cheese because Mia had a deep personal conviction about cheese, and the kitchen was warm and ordinary and smelled like the life he had built out of the hardest years of his life. And he thought about Vanessa in the dark conference room saying, "I stopped believing anyone would choose to push it with me." And he thought about how long a person could carry something like that before it became just the way they understood the world. He thought, not forever. Not if someone kept showing up. He put the fork in the sink. He went down the hall. He pushed open the door to the small room where Mia was sleeping with the crescent moon nightlight casting its low curve of light across the wall, and she was asleep. Genuinely asleep this time, with her hair spread across the pillow and her mouth slightly open and her arm wrapped around the stuffed animal she also claimed to be too old for. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went back to Carol's living room, where Carol had returned to her book and was not going to make any of the observations she was capable of making. And he said, "I might have something to tell you soon, about work. Good something or complicated something." He thought about it. "Both," he said. Carol turned a page. "The best things usually are," she said. He picked up his jacket and drove home through the clean, wet streets of a city that had come through its blackout and was running again. And somewhere in a building on the edge of downtown, a backup server was preserving the footage of a man in a basement corridor at 11:47. And a legal pad with 3 pages of handwritten analysis was now part of a formal record. And a CFO who had spent 7 years building something careful and invisible had reached the end of the particular run of luck that depended on nobody paying close enough attention. And in the executive suite on the 14th floor, the lights were off and the corridor was empty, and the floor lamp was exactly 18 inches to the left of where it used to be, which was where it had been for 6 weeks, which was exactly where it was supposed to be. The weeks after the board meeting moved differently than the weeks before it. Not faster, not slower, just differently, the way a river moves differently after it has come through a narrow and emerged into open water. The pressure that had been the ambient quality of the 14th floor for months was still present, but it had changed its character. It was the pressure of work now, real work, the kind that existed because a company had 4,000 employees and a market cap and a future that needed building, not the pressure of a man in a corner office arranging the furniture of other people's lives to suit his survival. Damian Cross was formally charged 6 weeks after the board meeting. The criminal investigation, which had begun with the fraud and expanded once the prosecution reviewed the blackout evidence, added charges that included sabotage of critical infrastructure and conspiracy to endanger. His attorney made several public statements in the tone of attorneys who are managing damage rather than building a defense, which was its own form of information. The general counsel, whose internal review had produced findings that the board described in formal language as significant compliance failures, resigned quietly on a Tuesday, and was replaced by someone from outside the company who had a reputation, according to Dennis, of not being anyone's person. The IT contractor who had helped fabricate the access logs gave a full formal statement which took 2 sessions and a great deal of careful legal framing, and which added a layer of technical corroboration to the case that the prosecution described as valuable. He kept his job. In the end, though he was moved to a different team in a different building because Vanessa had made a judgment call, the kind she no longer apologized for making, that the man had come forward, had kept the original file for reasons he couldn't fully explain, and that counted for something in the accounting of things. Ethan heard about most of this the way people heard about things that had resolved, in pieces, at a slight remove, each piece smaller than the one before it because the situation had lost its urgency and become just a legal matter moving through its legal channels. He followed it the way you followed something that had once been very close to you and was now at a manageable distance. With attention, but not anxiety. His 90-day probationary review had technically passed during the chaos of the board meeting week, without anyone formally scheduling it, and it had been rescheduled and then rescheduled again. And eventually Margaret Chen had said at a board level that the probationary classification seemed administratively awkward given everything, and that perhaps personnel should revisit the position classification entirely. Personnel had revisited it. The new classification was Senior Operations Advisor to the Executive Office, which came with a salary adjustment and a formal reporting structure, and the same desk outside the same double doors, because neither Ethan nor Vanessa had seen a reason to change the geography. He moved the floor lamp back 18 inches to confirm it was still correct. It was. The changes inside the company were slower than the legal proceedings and more durable. That was the thing about institutional culture. It moved at the pace of trust, which was not a fast pace, but it moved. What Vanessa did in the months after the board meeting was not a transformation. It was more incremental than that, and more honest. She didn't become a different person. She remained precise and demanding and unlikely to compliment your work when silence communicated the same thing. She still came in before 7:15 and still took lunch at her desk, except on Thursdays. She still ran meetings the way she'd always run them, without excess, without performance, with the particular efficiency of someone who respected other people's time because she respected her own. But the door was open more often. Not literally, not always, but in the sense that the 14th floor had a different quality to it, a more permeable one. Lynn noticed it and said nothing about it because Lynn operated on a principle of useful silence. Dennis noticed it and said something about it to Ethan in the way Dennis said things. With 2 coffees, leaning slightly, voice low. She stopped doing the thing, he said. What thing? The thing where you could feel her deciding whether to let you finish your sentence before she'd already formed her answer. He paused. She still forms the answer fast, but she's letting people finish now. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. The operational changes were more visible. 3 divisions that had been running on fractured communication structures were reorganized, with Ethan's involvement, into a model that required cross-divisional reporting at the operational level rather than waiting for everything to escalate to the executive suite. It reduced the volume of decisions that landed on Vanessa's desk by approximately 30%, which freed her to work at the level she was actually needed at, rather than the level of a system that had been built around one person's control and had never been designed to scale. There were arguments about it. There were 2 division heads who didn't like the restructuring and said so, one of whom said it in a board prep meeting in a way that was specifically aimed at Ethan's authority to propose it. Ethan presented the data, answered the objections without raising his voice, and waited. Vanessa, at the end of the meeting, said, "The restructuring moves forward. If there are concerns about implementation, bring them to Walker directly." She said it in a tone that was not unkind but was not ambiguous, and the meeting ended, and the restructuring moved forward. What neither of them said, in that meeting or anywhere else in a formal context, was that the restructuring had emerged from a conversation at 7:20 in the morning in Vanessa's office, when she'd said that she was tired of being the only decision point in a system that had been built to make her indispensable rather than to make the company functional. Ethan had said, "That's a solvable problem." She'd said, "I know. I've known for 2 years. I just didn't trust anyone to help me solve it." A pause. "I'm telling you now." He'd taken notes on his legal pad. The restructuring proposal was on her desk 3 days later. The foundation came from Vanessa's own thinking, developed over months, and Ethan learned about it the way he learned about most things she was working on, not through a formal announcement, but through the accumulation of references, the mentions in passing that had the quality of someone thinking out loud to the one person they didn't have to perform for. She mentioned it first in late October when Mia had been through twice more and had, on the second visit, spent 45 minutes in the small conference room helping Vanessa debug a presentation template that had developed a formatting problem. Not because Mia knew anything about presentation software, but because she had watched and asked questions and identified, with the particular focused curiosity of a child who had taken apart a toaster, the exact location of the formatting conflict. Vanessa had looked at her afterward with an expression that Ethan recognized as the one she got when someone had surprised her in a way she found genuinely useful. She should study engineering, Vanessa said, after Mia had gone back to the lobby to wait with Carol. She's 7, Ethan said. I know. I'm telling you for later. A pause. When I was 7, my father gave me a broken clock and told me it was mine to fix. I didn't know how. I took it apart completely and couldn't put it back together, and he said, "That's the first step." She looked at the conference room door. She's already passed the first step. He looked at her. What was the clock for? For learning that not knowing how is just the state you're in before you figure it out. She turned back to her screen. I've been thinking about a foundation. What kind? Employment, specifically for people with disabilities and single parents. People who have the competence but keep hitting structural barriers, hiring bias, accessibility gaps, scheduling inflexibility. Things that companies use as reasons not to hire someone when the real reason is that nobody designed the system to accommodate them. She paused. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I just needed to be certain the company was stable enough that it wouldn't look like distraction. Is it stable enough? We're up 11% from last quarter. She looked at him with flat eyes. Yes. Then what's the holdup? She was quiet for a moment. I didn't want to do it as performance, she said. I've seen foundations that exist to make executives look thoughtful. That's not what this is. I know it's not. I want it to be real, funded properly, structured properly, outcomes measured, not a letterhead. She paused. I want a board for it that includes people who have direct experience with the barriers it's meant to address. Not just people who think they understand the problem from the outside. Another pause. I want you on it, if you're willing. He looked at her. As what? As someone who understands what single parents need from an employment system. Because you've actually been one while trying to hold a job in a company that wasn't designed to make it easy for you. She held his gaze. Your experience is not a footnote, Walker. It's the whole point. He thought about the $45 field trip form. He thought about pickup at 3:15 and the grocery list that had been in his head on his first day when the elevator made its unhappy sound. He thought about the HR orientation, where Priya had said it's a reassignment and not explained why, and the Thursday physical therapy appointments listed as standing external meetings, and all the small architectural accommodations that people built around the things they didn't want to explain. Yeah, he said. I'm willing. The formal announcement of the Hale Foundation came in the second month of the new year. The press covered it in the way the press covered things that were adjacent to a story they'd already written. The CFO fraud case had attracted attention, and the foundation gave journalists a resolution arc that was easier to tell than the financial crime details. Vanessa gave one interview to a reporter she'd worked with before who asked direct questions and printed direct answers. And in it, she said that the foundation was not inspired by one event or one person, but by years of watching structural barriers function as a substitute for actual decision-making. She said the goal was outcomes, not symbolism. She said she expected to be held to that standard. The reporter asked about Ethan Walker, because the reporter had read the board meeting transcript, which was public record, and had noted the section where Vanessa had described him. Vanessa said, "He's the chief operations director and a member of the foundation board. Both of those things are because he's qualified for them." The reporter asked if there was anything else. Vanessa said, "That's what I said." The reporter, who was experienced, printed exactly what she said and noted the pause before it, because experienced reporters understood that what a person chose not to say was often as informative as what they said. Ethan read the article on a Saturday morning while Mia ate cereal at the kitchen table and told him about the science fair project she was planning, which had evolved from weather systems to a comparative analysis of atmospheric pressure in urban versus rural environments, and which she had decided needed a proper board with pushpins and string and which was going to require going to the craft store. It says she runs a foundation now, Mia said, looking at his phone screen upside down from across the table. She does. For people who need jobs? For people who have trouble getting jobs because of stuff that shouldn't matter. Mia thought about this with the seriousness she applied to things that she found genuinely interesting rather than just presented to her as important. That's good, she said. Some things shouldn't matter, but people act like they do. Yeah, he said. That's exactly right. Like how some kids at school act like it matters what kind of shoes you have. She ate a spoonful of cereal. It doesn't matter. No, he said. It doesn't. Does Vanessa know I think her foundation is good? I'll tell her. Mia nodded, satisfied, and returned to her cereal, and Ethan folded his phone and thought about how a 7-year-old had just summarized the premise of a foundation in 2 sentences that were more honest than the press release. The thing that had been building between him and Vanessa did not announce itself. That was the nature of it, and also, he suspected, the only way it could have happened, because both of them were people who had learned to distrust things that arrived with too much momentum, too much certainty. And if it had arrived any other way, they would have both found reasons to step back from it. It arrived in the space between work and something else. In the morning conversations that ran longer than they needed to. In the Thursday afternoons when she started coming back from physical therapy and stopping at his desk on her way through, not for anything operational, just stopping. The way people stopped when they were moving towards someone rather than past them. In the dinner that happened because a vendor meeting ran until 7, and they were both hungry and the conference catering had not been restocked, and someone said, "There's a place on Calder Street," and neither of them pretended not to know what kind of thing that was. The dinner on Calder Street was not perfect. The restaurant was louder than expected, and the table they were given was near the kitchen, and there was a moment, early on, where the professional distance that had been their default for months tried to reassert itself, and they both sat with it for a few minutes, looking at menus they weren't fully reading, before Vanessa said, "This is strange." "Yeah," he said. "We've been having dinner at your desk for 6 months." "That was different." "Was it?" He put his menu down. "You know it was." She looked at him across the table in a restaurant that was too loud and smelled like garlic, and had the particular warmth of a place that had been in business long enough to mean something to the neighborhood. She looked like herself, not the boardroom version, not the corporate biography version, not the version that appeared in press photos where she was positioned at precise angles and lit with the particular quality of carefully managed image. Just herself. 30 years old, tired from a long week, wearing a jacket that had a small mark on the left cuff she probably hadn't noticed, sitting in a chair at a table that was not ergonomically ideal, and managing it the way she managed everything, by not making it the subject. "I'm not very good at this," she said. "At what?" "At," she gestured vaguely, "at the general concept of the evening. At letting things be what they are, without needing to manage them." "I know," he said. "I'm not either. I spent 4 years not letting myself want things that would complicate Mia's life. And now?" He thought about it honestly. "Now I think I was confusing protecting her with protecting myself," he said. "She doesn't need me to be simple. She needs me to be real." Vanessa was quiet for a moment. "Your daughter told me once that I could be both serious and nice," she said. "I've been thinking about that for months." "She's right." "I know she's right. It's just—" She stopped. "I spent a long time after the accident deciding who I was going to be, and who I decided to be worked. It got me here. I don't know how to revise it without worrying that something load-bearing comes out with it." He looked at her. "The load-bearing thing isn't the distance," he said. "The load-bearing thing is you. The way you think, the way you work, the way you make decisions. That doesn't go anywhere." He paused. "The distance was just the scaffolding you built while you were putting up the structure. You don't have to keep the scaffolding." She looked at him for a long time. Outside the restaurant, the city did what cities did in the evening, moved and hummed and generated its ordinary light. The waiter came and they ordered, and the dinner happened the way dinners happened when 2 people had been talking around something for months and had finally sat down inside the actual thing, which was both easier and more complicated than the talking around it, and which was the only honest version. Mia figured it out before anyone told her. because Mia was observant in the way that children were observant when they had grown up in a household where attention was how you understood the people you loved. She figured it out on a Sunday in March when Vanessa came to Carol's building for a thing that had been described as a brief meeting about foundation board logistics. Ethan had not done a good job of presenting this cover story, and ended up staying for 3 hours and eating the lunch Carol insisted on, and during which Mia had shown her the atmospheric pressure project in full detail, including the pushpins and string, and Vanessa had asked 4 genuinely interested questions and identified one methodological improvement that Mia had immediately incorporated. On the drive home, Mia said, "Is Vanessa going to be around more?" "Probably," Ethan said. "Like, coming to things?" "Maybe, if she wants to." Mia looked out the window at the March afternoon, which had that particular tentative quality of early spring, when the warmth was real but not yet committed, still checking to see if it was wanted. "I think she should come to things," she said. "She didn't have anyone to eat lunch with before." He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "She has people she eats lunch with." "Work people," Mia said, with the authority of a 7-year-old who understood the distinction. "That's different." He kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah," he said. "It is." "She looked at you different today," Mia said, in a tone that was not accusatory or uncertain, but just informational. The tone of someone reporting an observation they found relevant. "Like how you look at me when you're really glad I'm there, but you don't want to make it weird by saying it." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You're too observant for 7, he said. 8 in June, she said. "I'm basically 8. She looked back out the window. "I like her," she said simply. "She's serious, but she's nice. I was right about that." He didn't have a better answer than that, so he didn't try to make one. Spring arrived fully in April, with the particular insistence of seasons that have been held back and arrive with accumulated energy. The company garden on the ground level of the NovaCore building, a narrow strip that ran along the east side of the building, between the exterior wall and the pedestrian walkway, had been replanted by facilities management as part of a building improvement project that Ethan had signed off on in February. It had box planters now, and a path that was properly surfaced and wide enough for a wheelchair, because when the landscaping plan had crossed his desk, he had made one note in the margin and sent it back. It was on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of April that the two of them were out there. Not for a meeting, not for anything scheduled. Vanessa had come down to look at the repair work on the east exterior wall that maintenance had been completing because she liked to see things in person rather than in reports. And Ethan had been heading to the parking structure, and they had both ended up in the garden at the same time, which was the kind of coincidence that stopped being a coincidence after the 4th or 5th occurrence. The afternoon was clear and cool. The planters had young things growing in them, still small enough that you had to look carefully to see what they were going to become. The path was dry and smooth, and the spring light had the quality it had in April, the particular gold that the angle of the season produced, the kind that made ordinary things look briefly like they had been considered. Mia was with them. She had come to the building after school that day because Carol had a late work thing, and because Mia had, over the past several months, become comfortable enough in the NovaCore lobby that Philip knew her name and her preferred elevator button, and the fact that she liked to look at the city from the 14th floor windows while she waited for her dad to finish whatever he was finishing. She was crouched at one of the planters examining something at the soil level with the focused attention of someone conducting a scientific inquiry. She had her school bag on and her jacket was unzipped, and she had a leaf in her hand that she was studying with great seriousness. Vanessa had stopped on the path and was watching her with the expression she'd been getting more often in recent months. The open one, the one that wasn't performing anything, the one that was just a person looking at something that made them glad. Ethan looked at both of them. He looked at the garden path, and the planters, and the afternoon light that didn't ask anyone's permission before it made things look good. He thought about the first morning he'd walked into this building with his folder and his daughter's tie knot and a 90-day probationary review and a grocery list in his head. And he thought about all the distances he'd covered since that morning, some of them measured in floors, and some of them measured in things that didn't have a unit. He had not planned this. He had not been building toward it. But there was a version of him, the 5:30 in the morning version who sat at kitchen tables with spreadsheets and tried to figure out how to carry what needed to be carried. Who would have said this is what carrying it got you? Not despite the hard years. Because of them. He reached into his jacket pocket. His hand closed around the thing he had been carrying for 3 weeks. Not because he'd been waiting for a specific moment, but because he hadn't wanted to force a moment. And this one had arrived on its own without being forced, which was the only kind he trusted. Vanessa turned from watching Mia and found him looking at her, and she read his face the way she read everything, accurately, quickly, with a quality of attention that didn't miss things. She looked at his hand in his pocket. She looked at him. "Walker," she said quietly. "Yeah," he said. He took out the ring. It was not elaborate. He had spent time on it, but not the kind of time that was about impressing someone. The kind that was about paying attention to what he knew about her, which was considerable, which had been accumulating since the morning he'd moved a floor lamp 18 inches and noted it as a passing grade. It was simple, considered, and completely her. A thin band. A stone that was not flashy but had a clarity to it that caught the afternoon light with quiet honesty. He didn't get down on one knee because the path was uneven, and because she was sitting in a wheelchair and kneeling down would have put them at the wrong kind of distance, and he knew she would find the conventional gesture awkward rather than romantic. He crouched instead, to her level, the way he had crouched to Mia's level outside the elevator on her first visit, the way he had instinctively done because it was how he communicated that he was meeting someone where they were rather than asking them to reach up. "I know what I'm asking," he said. "I know it's not simple. It comes with a 7-year-old who will explain weather systems to you at breakfast and has strong opinions about cheese and will probably be better at everything you're good at by the time she's 20. He paused. "And I know you've spent a long time deciding you were enough on your own, and I'm not saying you weren't. You were. You are." He looked at her. "But I think we're more together than we are separate. And I think Mia knows it already, and Carol knows it, and I think maybe you know it too, and I'd rather ask the question and have you answer it than spend the next 30 years being careful." Vanessa had gone very still. Not the boardroom stillness, not the performance of composure, the other kind, the kind that happened when something arrived that was real and large and required the whole person to receive it. Her eyes were bright. She was not someone who cried easily, and she was not crying, but the brightness was there, the kind that happened at the edges of things that mattered. "You moved a floor lamp for me," she said. Her voice was steady, but only just. "Day 2, he said. "You climbed a 40-foot maintenance shaft in the dark." The fan was off. Walker. Vanessa. She looked at him. She looked at the ring which sat in his open hand between them in the afternoon light. She looked at the garden that had a path wide enough for her chair because he had made one note in a margin without making a production of it. She looked at Mia, who had stood up from the planter and turned around and was now watching them with the expression of a child who has understood the situation and is deciding how to respond to it, which took approximately 4 seconds. "Yes," Vanessa said. "Obviously, yes." Mia said, "Finally," with great feeling and some exasperation and the satisfaction of someone whose assessment had been correct all along. Ethan put the ring on Vanessa's finger. His hands were not entirely steady, which was honest, and the ring fit, which was something he had arranged carefully through Carol, who had the kind of friendship with Vanessa that developed between people who respected each other's competence and didn't require extensive maintenance, and who had been remarkably composed when Ethan had called her 3 weeks ago and said he needed a ring size. Vanessa looked at her hand. She looked at him. She said quietly so that it was between them and not a performance, "I don't know how to do this. I want you to know that. I haven't let myself want something like this in a long time." "I know," he said. "Me either." "I'll probably manage it sometimes when I shouldn't," she said. "I'll probably have bad weeks where I go back to the distance because it's what I know." "I know," he said again. "And you'll tell me." "Yeah," he said. "And you'll do the same." She nodded. It was not a fairy tale agreement. It was the more useful kind. The kind made between imperfect people who know exactly what they're committing to and are doing it anyway, with full information, which was the only kind that had a chance of lasting. Mia came over and put both arms around Vanessa's neck from the side, the way she hugged people she had decided fully and permanently to love, and Vanessa put her hand up and held her arm, and closed her eyes for just a moment with the expression of someone receiving something they had stopped believing would come. "Are we a family now?" Mia asked, directly into Vanessa's shoulder. Vanessa opened her eyes. She looked at Ethan over Mia's head. "We were already a family," Ethan said. "We just made it official." Mia considered this, and then she pulled back and looked at both of them with the evaluative expression she used when she was determining whether an answer met her standards. Apparently it did. "Okay," she said. "Can we get food? I'm hungry." Vanessa made a sound that was entirely a laugh this time. Not the almost version, not the before the smile version, but an actual laugh, full and real, the kind that happened when something broke through the last of the careful management and came out anyway. It was a good sound. It had the quality of something that had been in there for a while, waiting. There were things that didn't resolve cleanly, because that was the nature of things. The criminal proceedings against Cross moved through their timeline in the way criminal proceedings moved, not fast, not neat. There would be more hearings, more disclosures, more months of institutional and legal machinery doing its slow work. The general counsel's departure had left gaps that took time to fill. 2 board members who had been in Cross's orbit resigned within the quarter, which opened spaces that had to be thoughtfully filled, and the thoughtful filling of board spaces was not a fast process. The company's culture, 3 years in the making of one kind and now working toward another, did not transform in months. It moved, and there were setbacks. And sometimes Vanessa came out of a meeting with the look of someone who had just spent an hour pushing against institutional momentum and needed 10 minutes of open air before she could approach the next thing. Ethan's title changed. His position changed. His access, his responsibilities, his role in the company's actual decision-making. All of it changed, and none of it changed who he was, which was the point. He was not the same man who had walked in on a gray Tuesday with a folder and a too-tight tie, but the difference was not in his values or his orientation toward the world. It was just in what the world had given him room to do. The Hale Foundation opened its doors in the fall, fully staffed, properly funded, with a board that included 4 people with direct experience of the barriers it was designed to address. One of whom was a single parent who had been referred through a workforce program, one of whom used a wheelchair, one of whom was a woman who had been passed over for 3 promotions before anyone called it what it was, and one of whom was Ethan Walker, who had gotten his current position by reading an operations manual cover to cover and noticing a missing line item on a Thursday evening. In its first year, the foundation placed over 400 people in employment, negotiated accessibility partnerships with 11 companies, and launched a childcare subsidy program for single parents in qualifying positions that was not perfect. Nothing was perfect, Vanessa said in the foundation's first annual report, and she meant it, but that was real and measurable, and would be better next year than it was this year, which was the best thing you could say about any program that was actually trying. Mia won 2nd place at the regional science fair with her atmospheric pressure comparison study. She was furious about the 2nd place for approximately 40 minutes, and then decided that the methodology notes from the judge were actually useful, and went home to revise the project for the state competition. She revised it in Vanessa's home office, using Vanessa's second monitor, explaining her changes out loud to Vanessa, who asked 4 questions, identified 2 improvements, and told her that 2nd place with a project that could win state after revision was more valuable than 1st place with a project that had nowhere to go. Mia thought about this. Then she said, "You're kind of a good coach." "Don't tell anyone," Vanessa said. "I have a reputation." Mia laughed, and the sound of it filled the office, which was not an office that had previously contained much laughter, and which was better for it. Okay. The thing about the story of Ethan Walker and Vanessa Hale was that it was not a story about rescue. It was easy to tell it that way. The man who pulled the CEO from the edge, the woman who let someone in for the first time, the daughter who melted the frozen heart, the hidden villain unmasked. That version existed and was not false. But it missed the thing that was actually true. The true thing was this: both of them had been carrying their lives alone for years and doing it competently, and the competence was real and had cost them both something real to build. They had not been waiting to be saved. They had not been incomplete. They had been 2 people moving through the world on their own terms, with their own scars and their own stubborn systems, and they had happened to move into the same corridor. and the corridor had turned out to be a place where neither of them had to be quite as alone as they had decided to be. That was not rescue. That was something more ordinary and more difficult. It was two people choosing, with full information about what the other person cost and contained, to keep showing up. Not because it was easy, not because it resolved into something simple, but because the alternative, going back to the version of themselves that had been sufficient but not quite enough, had stopped feeling like an option once they knew what else was possible. Mia knew this intuitively, the way children knew things they didn't have words for yet. She had known it the day she walked off the elevator with her dinosaur backpack and looked at a wheelchair and saw something interesting instead of something to manage. She had known it when she saved pasta on low and wrote the third message for Carol to pass along. I love you, and I knew you wouldn't be late, even if you were late. She had known it every time she said we without thinking about it, because we was already the right word, had been the right word for longer than any of the adults had been willing to say it out loud. Some people spent their whole lives building walls between themselves and the possibility of being known, and called it strength, and it worked well enough as long as nobody came along who was patient enough to sit with them in the dark without making it into something they had to manage. Vanessa had been one of those people, and had known it, and had done it anyway because the alternative was a kind of vulnerability that the accident and the years after had made feel like danger. What she learned, not all at once, not cleanly, but in the accumulation of a man who moved floor lamps and read building manuals and showed up in a 40-foot maintenance shaft on a night when showing up was the most expensive possible thing to do, was that vulnerability was not the same as weakness, that needing someone was not the same as being diminished by needing them. That strength, real strength, was not the ability to not need anyone. It was the willingness to say, I need you and I trust you with that, and I'm going to choose you every day regardless. Ethan had learned the other side of it, that protecting his daughter did not mean keeping the world small, that giving Mia a full life meant letting his own life be full too, that the grief he had carried for 4 years, real grief, legitimate grief, the grief of a man who had lost his partner and his plan for the future simultaneously, was not something to be solved or overcome, but something that had become part of the structure of who he was, load-bearing in its own way, and that it was possible to build new things without taking it out. None of this was a lesson anyone delivered. It was just the thing that was true when you looked at it clearly, which both of them were learning to do. On a Tuesday morning in late spring, Ethan walked into the NovaCore lobby at 7:48 with his badge and his jacket and a tie that Mia had chosen. Dark blue, no pattern. She said he was important enough not to need a pattern anymore, and he nodded to Philip, who said, "Morning, mister." Walker, in the way of 11 years of atmospheric reading, and he took the elevator to the 14th floor, and the floor lamp was where it was supposed to be, and the double doors were closed because Vanessa was already in before 7:15, and on his desk there was a coffee from the executive kitchen that had not been there when he'd left last night. He picked it up. He looked at the closed double doors. He sat down and opened his computer and started his day. 20 minutes later, the doors opened and she came through with her tablet and her cup and the forward momentum that was just how she moved through space, and she stopped at his desk on her way past, which was not the original protocol and had not been the original protocol for a long time. And she looked at her ring in the morning light for a half second in the way she sometimes still did, like she was confirming something she found genuinely surprising. "Walker," she said. "Morning." Mia texted me this morning at 6:45 to say she revised the atmospheric pressure methodology. I told her not to text before 7. She said 7 was a social construct. He closed his eyes briefly. "She's 8. Almost 9. Vanessa was already turning back toward her office. "She's right about the methodology, by the way. The revision improves it." A pause. "Tell her from me." "Tell her yourself," he said. "She'll be here at 4. She made a small sound that was a compressed version of everything good, and went back through the double doors, and the 14th floor had its morning quality, the particular combination of purpose and warmth that it had taken months to grow into, and that Ethan suspected would be there for a long time. Imperfect, adjusting, real. Outside the windows, the city was doing what the city did in late spring, moving through its ordinary Tuesday with its ordinary indifference, enormous and unhurried, full of corridors that people walked through every day and never thought about until the moment something happened that made them matter. Full of elevators and floor lamps and maintenance tunnels and parking structure staircases and Thursday entries on calendars, and second monitors in home offices and foil-covered pasta on low heat, waiting. Full of ordinary things that turned out, on closer inspection, to be the whole story.